Hello and welcome to Six Part. Today I'm gonna continue the story What If Deku Became the Ultimate Spider-Man Part 2. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up, and to watch more videos like this, subscribe to my channel and turn that bell notification on so you never miss an upload. Now wasting no more time, let's begin.
Overhaul wasn't the most understanding person. He had anticipated that Kurono would arrive in a few minutes after telling him that he knew someone who could assist them. As a matter of fact, however, it took Kurono a full day to return with an elderly guy. The man was escorted into his office wearing a neat, spotless suit, a blue necktie, gear-shaped goggles, and a bushy mustache. The portly man remarked, "I've been informed that you wanted to hire me." "Is this some sort of joke?" Overhaul said, scowling at the man before turning to face Kurono. "Only if you find it funny," the individual said. "I assure you that this man can help us. He is, after all, a man that can replicate quirks." "Replicate?" Overhaul said, his eyes widening above his disease mask. "One of my greatest achievements, however, it is not my true masterpiece," the rotund guy said with a broad smile, his blue eyes glinting behind the goggles as he laughed and took off his hat in a kind of faux bow. To Chisaki's chagrin, he sat down and laughed, saying, "And this young man tells me that you have a rather unique situation, and an even more so opportunity. I have yet to unleash my true magnum opus upon this world, as one would commonly say." With a pout, Overhaul gave in and said, in a manner of speaking, "Yes. Then this may yet prove to be beneficial for the both of us," the man said, spreading his hands in front of himself. He smiled that twisted grin once more, which made Overhaul cringe inwardly. This individual had an unpleasant air about him. "The problem is that the subject that I was using for materials is beyond my reach now," Overhaul said, "and none of my men think it wise to make a move on her location." The man sighed almost dreamily. "If I could harvest samples from the students there, I could almost die a happy man." "Ah, yes, that absurd hero school, UA, he said, scoffing. "Oh, but what a treasure trove of potential crops. You have superior forces, and many of them are loyal to you to a fault. Help us secure the girl, and then your forces can harvest as many samples as you want, and even strike a blow against UA's famous reputation." Kurono saw an opportunity to bait the proverbial hook, asking, "Then why not help us retrieve our asset?" Overhaul noticed a slight tremor in his voice, indicating that he was afraid of this man. As he reached up to twirl his mustache, the man said, hum, laughing in his throat, "You certainly know how to tickle an old man's fancy, my young friend. And my beautiful children will finally have their chance to shine. And if, by chance, this asset of yours crosses my men's path, then I shall, indeed, make a bid for her," he said, smiling, putting his fingers together and sitting back. "As long as you can make it worth my whiles." "If it's money you want, then," groaned Overhaul. "Money is not what I desire," the elderly guy said. Overhaul, who detested interruptions, clasped his hands together in mute rage. He gestured to the younger man and said, "You already know what exotic delights can sat my palate. Quirks. Powerful and unique quirks. Yours." Overhaul almost coughed, but he soon pulled himself together. "You want," he said, "you want to take my quirk from me?" "I do not have that type of power," stated the individual. "What I meant was that I want a sample of your DNA with your active quirk genes." He elaborated, "I've heard a great deal about you from those that fear your reach. Kai Chisaki." Overhaul's eyes widened. The young head of the 8 Precepts of Death Yakuza group, a dying breed of criminals that have been smuggling trigger, and a quirk erasing bullet, I believe? Kurono winced and yelled at the man, "I never told you any of that," as he chuckled. "Ho ho ha ha. I have eyes and ears all across the world, my dear boy," he laughed. "My particular quirk has allowed me to do many things these last 200 plus years." The two older men's eyes widened. "I have seen quirks from the very first child and all the way up until this point, and I will say that yours is quite possibly the most powerful one I've seen to date." Those beady eyes scowled at Overhaul, and he grinned broadly. "A quirk that can disassemble and reassemble living and non-living matter on the cellular level without any adverse effects. And your subject, a child if I'm to believe what I've been told, has the power to rewind a person's body to the point of non-existence if she were to lose control. But you're engineering her quirk genes to target other quirk genes and wipe them out." He grinned. "Such a marvelous quirk this little darling has." "You know a little too much for my liking, old man," Overhaul said, starting to take off his gloves as he felt his sanity ebbing. "As informative as this meeting has been, I can't just let you walk away." "Yes, if I were in your shoes, I would also want to be silenced," the man said, his smile only getting bigger and bigger. With a "glad we can understand each other," Overhaul began to stand up, Don't worry, though, I'm told there's only a minor bit of discomfort. Oh, you misunderstand me, my dear boy, the man said, laughing again. He put his hat on his head and gazed at him from behind the rim, grinning broadly. You see, he said. Kurono turned only a fraction of a second too slowly, and his eyes widened. Boss! He yelled, but it was too late, for behind Shisaki a huge warp gate materialized. What the hell? Overhaul exclaimed as he turned and was abruptly seized from behind by several hands that emerged from the dark doorway. One of the hands grabbed his wrists and pushed him onto his desk, while another appeared and pushed his head downward. Now, boys, do be careful to keep his hands from touching anything, the man said cheerfully as he got up from his chair. And Mr. Kurono, was it? He asked, looking at the man in the white robes. I wouldn't try anything if I were you. His sickening smile was now uncontrollably wide. My children are more than strong enough without their quirks to snap your master's neck at the snap of my fingers. He strode forward, grabbing a syringe from his pocket. Now, then, he said, standing just above Overhaul's neck. With his eyes gleaming evilly behind his glasses, the man murmured, "Oh, that reminds me," as Overhaul felt the needle on his skin. All for One sends his regards. Spiderman. When Izuku attempted to attend school the following day, he discovered that Eri was not amenable at all. But Daddy, I don't want you to go. The child cried in a panic, gripping the leg of his pants without letting go. You went to school yesterday. Why do you have to go there again? Izuku tried to reason with the child, saying, well, I have to if I'm going to become a hero, but she didn't appear to want to accept it. He was certain the teachers would understand, but at this pace he was going to be late. He hoped they would, however. Eri, Hisashi said, you really shouldn't, but was interrupted by his son's stern expression. It seems that anything related to Eri was crossing his son's boundary. Inko made the choice to intervene. What he means, dear, is that going to school is very important to young people, she stated. You know the lessons I've been giving you every day? Teaching you to read and write, mathematics and other things? Eri nodded shyly. Well, Izuku's doing that, too, just more of it so that he can be a hero, and a better father to you, dear, she replied. So what do you say? Won't you let him go? Eri's lip quivered, and Izuku saw that her tiny horn started to flash dimly. But I get scared when Daddy's not with me. Eri whispered in a voice so small that it pierced Izuku's defenses. He inhaled deeply, bent over, and held the young girl in his arms. You can come with me, he murmured smilingly, then patted her on the nose in an effort to appear serious. But just for today, all right? He said. Really? Eri's eyes glowed. Izuku exclaimed, yes, really, as she laughed at the abrupt shift in her attitude. But it's going to be scary. We have combat training today. Eri grinned broadly and saw that, although it had grown slightly in size, the brightness from her horn had gone completely out. Fearing that the small girl's power may erupt once more, he murmured, I hope May gets that prototype ready soon. Concerned for her grandchild, Inko fidgeted anxiously and questioned, are you sure that's a good idea, sweetie? Won't the fighting scare her? She and Hisashi both knew that the more stressed the youngster was, the more energy she stored in her horn. Probably, but Kyoko will be there in case things go badly, Izuku said with a sigh and a slow nod. Eri's expression brightened once more at the name of her second favorite person. She knows how to keep her calm. Hisashi said, I need to go on patrol, and he picked up his costume-containing backpack. For what it's worth, he said, leaning down to his son's ear as he headed for the door, you're doing a better job than I ever could. Izuku said softly, that's because I'm here for her, and I always will be. Hisashi nodded, good. He opened the door, only to be confronted by a rambunctious mechanic with pink hair. May said, whoa, perfect timing. Just before she knocked, you know, you've grown since the last time I saw you, and that was only yesterday, she said, scowling as she looked up and down at Hisashi. Hisashi was speechless, saying, Izuku said, May, I'm over here, as he peered out from behind his dad. That's my dad. May simply chuckled and exclaimed, no wonder you look so alike, before extending an invitation to enter. Damn the man at the entrance. She took a big brown box from behind her back and said, but whatever. Hey, Spider Guy, I got those new capture items for you. You're gonna love these. Capture. Oh, you mean my power cuffs, Izuku said, glancing at her. That's a super cute name for this new baby. The girl nodded. And super simple to make. May pulled out a black band with blue highlights from inside the box. Just slap this over the wrist of whoever you want, and it's bye-bye quirk. Super safe, super effective, and super strong. It'd take 50 pounds of C4 to bust these babies up, she said. The young child in his arms remarked, "It's pretty," as Mei grinned at her. Taking the one Mei was holding, Izuku grinned and said, "I had these made for you, sweetie." He then let one curl around her wrist. Securing itself tightly around her small wrist, it illuminated, turning the blue lights green to indicate that it was functioning. As her horn started to fade and the dim glow went out, he remarked, "Now you won't have to worry about your quirk hurting people until you learn to control it." "The best part is that these babies use thermal batteries," Mei said. "You never have to charge them. You can safely wear them forever if you want to, and your own body heat will keep them charged up." Izuku said, "Now that was a great idea," with a smile. "Wasn't it?" Mei smiled. "Well, I have another delivery to make before work resumes." She put the box down, turned, and stormed out the door, saying, "As soon as you want to make some more babies, let me know." Izuku simply smiled as she walked away, having become a little accustomed to her excessive warmth. In contrast, his mother was looking at her kid and began to query, "Now, by babies, she doesn't actually mean. She means her inventions, Mom." Izuku responded quickly before pulling out his phone to check the time. "Oh, shoot," he exclaimed, reaching into the box, grabbing a handful of the cuffs to put in his pocket, and rushing past his father. "See you guys tonight," he added. Hisashi grinned at his wife after tending to his son. "I thought you said he didn't take much after me?" he asked. "Well," Inko chuckled, "that rushing around thing he does definitely came from you." Tsupaidamon Kyoka was waiting for him outside the school, tapping her foot impatiently, just as she had done the day before. But as soon as she saw him, her annoyance vanished because he was holding young Eri on his shoulders. She waved to the young kid on his shoulders, who slowly waved back, "Morning you too. I take it she didn't want to let you go this morning?" Izuku gave a shy laugh. "Yeah," he replied, "sorry to make you wait on us." She turned and said, "It's cool," as he fell in behind her as she entered the school. "Homeroom doesn't start for another 5 minutes, so we should just make it before Ida gives us a ticket for tardiness." "He can do that." Izuku smiled and chuckled. Laughing, Kyoka said, "Would if he could." Eri said, "Daddy, what's a ticket?" Kyoka smiled and remarked, "It's nothing you need to worry about, sweetie," before leaning over to Izuku's shoulder and asking, "But will she be alright? Her quirk?" Izuku gave a headshake. "Mei delivered the power-dampening cuffs this morning, and Eri's wearing one of them," he said while pointing to the band on the child's hand. "She couldn't use her quirk now even if she wanted to." He grinned, "And it's totally safe. None of the build-up she felt when we were teaching her how to use her quirk." With a small sigh of relief, Kyoka said, "Good." As they moved down the hallway, the three received strange looks, with the majority of them focusing on Eri. Eri was unknown to first-year students, but most second- and third-year students were aware of her from the 2 months the young girl had been on campus. The poor little child was shrinking in on herself further as a result of all those eyes on her, or at least hiding behind Izuku's wild hair. "They're all looking at me." Looking up at her, Izuku said, "It's just because you're such a cute little girl," adding that it seemed strange for a high school student to be carrying a 5-year-old girl about with a pretty girl his own age. Similarly, Kyoka thought, "They probably think we're your mommy and daddy." The young girl gave a blink. Eri said, perplexed, "But he is my daddy." When they got to their classroom, Izuku simply chuckled at the pointless teasing. He crouched down and took her off his shoulders, saying, "I want you to behave yourself, Eri. We're going to meet my classmates, and they're all very pleasant." Kyoka reminded him, not all of them," with the ends of her jacks protruding menacingly. "And so help me if he tries anything with her." With a laugh, the youngster said, Come on, even Kachan's not that." He paused to reflect, but then dreadful visions of Eri being tormented by the explosive blonde came to him. "You know what? Never mind." Grasping Eri's left hand while Izuku took her right, Kyoka grinned and said, "That's what I thought." She then giggled and said, "Now, let's introduce Eri to our class." A voice behind them said, "Pardon me, but this is Class 1A, right?" A tall, slender student was standing to Izuku's left when he turned. He looked somewhat like Aizawa, but he lacked the weariness that Aizawa always appeared to have. His light purple hair stood straight up like Kirishima's, but it was obvious that he didn't use hair gel. "Yeah, this is 1A, Izuku said with a smile. "Are you a new student?" The kid nodded. "Yeah, Mr. Aizawa came by the dorms last night and told me to pack my things." He sighed, "Not how I thought I'd get a spot in the hero course, but I won't complain." "You're an improvement over the guy that got kicked out, I'll say that much," Kyoka responded, nodding to him. "Come on, Aizawa's probably on his way, so we'd better hurry up." She then slid the door wide. As the newly formed quartet entered the room, Tenya Iida yelled, "You're late." Eri was so startled that she immediately leapt into Kyoka's arms. "Miss Jiro, who is that child? It's against school regulations too." Kyoka refused to accept it. Nobody got away with frightening her little unicorn. Before the speedster could finish, she was jabbing him in both ears with her flying jacks. "Don't you start at me on regulations, Iida. You've scared her half to death, you engine blockhead." Izuku was so furious at Kyoka after she hit him that he thought he saw Iida vibrating. The new student said, "Is she always like that?" He grinned. Izuku extended his hand and replied, "Only when it concerns Eri. Sorry, Izuku Midoriya." The teenager quickly said, "Hitoshi Shinso," and shook the boy's hand. Tsuyu Asui asked from her seat, "Say, Midoriya, if you don't mind, who's that little girl you brought with you?" "Yeah, she's super adorable," Mina exclaimed as she gazed at the young child with a broad smile. Before exhaling, the boy thought, "Well, here we go, she's my adopted daughter." "She's so cute," exclaimed Toru Hagakure. Kirishima was beaming. "Super manly that you took a kid in, Midori bro, but wouldn't it have been better if your mom adopted her?" Despite his intense gaze on the young girl, Katsuki remained silent. "You remember yesterday when I said that Green Bean here took a bullet for a kid?" The person using the earphone jack questioned, looking at him, and patting Eri's hair. Kyoka turned to the rest of the class and said, "This is her, and her name is Eri," pulling her jacks away from Tenya's ears so the boy could sag. "So she's pretty much claimed him as her father figure. She's pretty shy, too, so don't crowd her. Okay, guys?" Kyoka gave Bakugo and Iida a pointed glare, respectively. "Okay," was the group response. As Kyoka sat down, Mina whimpered, "Aw, man. And here I thought we could be horn buddies." Hitoshi and Izuku did the same, with the new student occupying Minetta's seat behind the verdette. To Kyoka's dismay, Eri quickly descended and joined Izuku at his desk. "HMPH, still a daddy's little girl, huh?" Kyoka said. "Teased, jealous?" Izuku asked. "Damn it, sure, I am." Kyoka pondered in her mind. All Might yelled, "I am here," as he rushed through the classroom door, coming through the door like a hero, before it could go any more. On any other day, Kyoka would have almost freaked out when All Might appeared in the classroom, but instead she looked at Izuku and Eri, the former comfortingly caressing the latter's back while she concealed her face in his shoulder. As the number one hero strode to the front of the class, the other students became raucous with enthusiasm. He exclaimed, looking around the classroom, "Welcome, my dear young students, to your first official day of the hero course. And I see that we have some new faces with us today. Welcome, young Shinso, to Class 1A's hero course," he said with a grin that was bigger than ever as he turned to face Shinso. "I was absolutely delighted to find out that you had accepted the transfer to the hero course, and I hope that you will be with us for the remainder of your time here," he said. After getting up, Hitoshi bowed to the man and said, "Thank you, sir." As she emerged from hiding, the hero grinned broadly and said, "And while I am unaware of the details that brought her here today, welcome to Class 1A, little Eri. I hope you'll enjoy your time with us today." The hero was looking at the young girl who was still hiding in her father's shoulder. Izuku laughed. "What do we say, Eri, for example?" The girl stammered, thank you very much, sir." But All Might and the other students found it satisfactory. Kyoka stammered, "She's even got your stutter." "Oh my gosh, please let me hold her," Mina cried, squealing as she clutched at her heart. He smiled and said, "Here at UA we believe in the most practical of approaches, so that means we're going out beyond the shallow end, and diving head first into the deep end." All Might laughed loudly and said, "Now then, on with today's lesson." He took a large card from the desk and said, "Which means combat training." Activating his quirk on his arms, Kirishima said, "Yes, this is my kinda class." "About damn time," Bakugo said, his palms crackling and smoldering. All Might exclaimed, "Yes indeed," and held up a remote control of some kind. "But before we begin, you all seem to be missing something that is an absolute must for being a hero." He hit the button, and the wall on the room's west side began to shift. He smiled and said, "Everyone, please take your suits and head to the locker rooms to get changed. And then you will make your way to Training Field Gamma. Don't dawdle." He then went like a rocket out of the room and down the hall. Because what hero goes into battle without their very own unique costume? He said. Spiderman. It made Izuku feel sorry for Shinso. Even though the school gave him a bulletproof vest for protection, he had nothing to change into because he had just been transferred, and unless his quirk was strong, which Izuku doubted because he was passed up and put in general studies, he had little to nothing to help him. On the other hand, his quirk may not be combat-suited, but it is still quite potent. In the meantime, he could sense the looks of every other boy in the locker room as he dressed. Izuku's upper body, including his back and chest, was covered with scars, as Kyoka had previously discovered. And not just any scars. Burn scars. However, no one had the courage to speak. In contrast, his costume. Denki Kaminari remarked, "Geez, Midoriya, that's one serious costume," when Izuku had completed pulling the top half over his head and had secured his utility belt around his waist. Then he flexed the clawed fingers and put on the gauntlets with his upgraded web shooters. "I mean, dude, you look like you're ready for a hell of a throwdown." Izuku glanced at his classmate with his typical warm smile and said, "I'd have to be a complete idiot to underestimate anyone here." He addressed the electrification quirk wielder, saying, "Anyone here could be dangerous," nodding to Denki before turning to face Katsuki, who gave him a sneer. "Or deadly." He nodded, acknowledging him, "So before going into this lesson I figured that I'd damned well better be prepared at war." Kirishima raised his voice, "Now that's a real man for ya," he continued, "and thanks for the respect all around. Both you and Baku bro look like pros already. Those cannot be just for show." Izuku thought frightfully, "If anything, I bet he's figured out how to store up his nitro sweat for one massive release of firepower." He noted the grenade-shaped bracers on Katsuki's arms and put on his mask. Rikido Sato yelled, "You're the one that fought with that B-rank villain, and put him away," as the other boys gasped, "Hey, I recognize that suit now." "Midoriya, how could you?" Tenya asked angrily. "I thought you were a decent sort, but you resorted to conducting vigilantism?" Tenya had the wrong notion right away. "Of course not," Izuku yelled, sounding nearly irate. "I was given permission to fight so I could protect my family." "Dude, seriously not cool," Kirishima said, glancing at the speedster. "Think about stuff before you just blurt things out," scowled the red-haired hardening quirk bearer. After finishing his self-arming, Izuku made careful to attach some of his power cuffs to his belt before leaving the locker area, where Kyoka and the other girls were waiting for him with Eri. Daddy. He was going to be bull-rushed as soon as he left the house, and it didn't take his spider sense to figure that out. When Eri first saw him, she virtually sprang into his arms. Toru whispered to Mina, "Whoa, that's Midoriya? Talk about intimidating." Mina laughed mischievously and murmured back, "No kidding, kinda hot, though." "Very," Toru said, laughing. Kyoka wanted to plug her collar in and shout at them. "It's not like he's not in the market, but why, God, can't he take a hint?" She told herself, "Calm down, girl." She let out a sigh of mild exasperation. "Your costume looks really amazing, Midoriya," Tsuyu replied. "I know that frogs are technically a spider's worst enemy, but I wouldn't want to tangle with you." "I think I'll take that as a compliment," Izuku remarked, grinning under his mask. "Is that the new choker?" he said, turning to face Kyoka. Izuku recognized that it must have been the other delivery that Mei had hurried off to make earlier that morning when Kyoka smiled at him and stated, "Sure is," adding, "stronger and lighter. The perfect thing to blast someone with a sound wave." As Momo was admiring his physique, which was clearly defined by the suit, she blushed a little and said, "Ahem, perhaps we should hurry things up and head toward the training area." She gestured down the hall, saying, "Best not to keep our teacher waiting." With Kyoka walking behind him, Izuku nodded and turned toward the exam area. "Say, where's Miss Uraraka?" he said, observing that she was the only girl missing. Recalling the girl's embarrassment when she attempted to put on her suit but had to strip naked in order for it to fit, Kyoka blushed and stammered, She had a little wardrobe malfunction." The girl's drool-worthy curves made her think, almost jealously. "By the way, I noticed that you act a little differently when you're in costume. I feel a whole lot more confident when I wear this." Izuku simply shrugged, then turned to face her with the emerald eyes that glowed in his outfit. "Kyoka, can you do something for me?" he asked. Sure, what is it?" she asked, raising her eyebrow. "Kachan has a huge pair of braces on his wrists," she said, frowning, not quite understanding what he was getting at. "I think they're meant to store up a huge amount of his nitro sweat, so he can fire off a large-scale explosion," she said, blushing at the thought of him getting so close to her ear. "If you have to face him, then watch out for those things. If he's got enough stored up, it could easily take down a building." "You're kidding, right?" Kyoka asked, feeling as though she would soon become ill. As they emerged into the light, he shook his head and said, "Not about this. So please, if you face him, be careful." The rest of their classmates followed, and when Kyoka saw Bakugo's costume, she understood exactly what Izuku meant. He appeared really scary and disturbed. She whispered to him, "Are those grenades on his belt? If you're pitted against him, he always leads off with a right haymaker." Izuku nodded, as if he thought so. He scowled at the ashen blonde, praying that his opponent was strong enough to take him on. "They all look so pretty," Eri said, gazing around at everyone wearing their hero costumes. Izuku adored the ghostly smile that was on her face. When All Might abruptly entered the scene, he said, "Yes, they do, young Eri. You all look amazing. Real heroes in the making." He heard the words, "Oh, wow," coming from Ochako's voice. "Who's that in the purple and green?" "That's Midoriya, Ochako," Tsuyu replied. "Couldn't you tell from the way Eri's clinging to him?" Izuku looked around and was grateful for his mask for all time. When he saw how the girl was dressed, he couldn't have helped but light up like a Christmas tree. Ochako's costume left nothing to the imagination, in contrast to Mina and Momo's revealing suits, which both flaunted a good deal of skin. He sobbed and then turned aside, the eyes on his mask widening. "Oh, dear God." Kyoka couldn't help but inquire, "Got a stiffy?" in a voice so low that only he could hear. He screamed, "What's that supposed to mean?" The female let out a loud chuckle. "Oh, I wish I could see your face. This looks to be the same area we used for the entrance exams. Will we be using it for today's lesson?" Tenya's voice yelled from a fully armored suit. "All Might, sir." "You're right, young Iida," All Might said, pointing to a box with a rounded opening in the top. "As I mentioned earlier in the classroom, we will be conducting a type of indoor combat training today. The training will be undertaken in teams of 2, meaning that you will also be undergoing teamwork exercises. Each team will be decided by drawing a random lot from this box. Those with matching lots will be teammates. One team will be acting as the hero team, and, of course, the opposing team will be acting as the villain team, which I will be choosing at random as well." Tenya said, "Sir, what determines a win?" Bakugo questioned, "Can't I just blow the other team up?" "We don't have to worry about getting expelled if we fail like in Aizawa's test, do we?" replied Tsuyu. Aoyama questioned, "Isn't my cape magnifique?" A victory is determined by capturing the opposing team, or the mission objective target. All Might was almost overwhelmed by the questions, but he barely kept up. He answered Iida before turning to Katsuki, saying, "Young Bakugo, this lesson may include combat, but blowing up your classmates will only get you a one-way ticket to Tartarus." He patted Tsuyu's head and said, "And of course not, young Asui, how could I threaten you like that?" before grinning broadly and giving Aoyama the thumbs up. "Wow, he actually got all that?" Kyoka snorted. As All Might started arranging them for the drawings, Izuku whispered, "Number 1 hero for a reason, remember?" Team A. Hitoshi Shinso and Izuku Midoriya. Team B. Shoto Todoroki and Mezzo Shoji. Team C. Momo Yaoyorozu and Ochako Uraraka. Team D. Tenya Iida and Katsuki Bakugo. Team E. Yuga Aoyama and Mina Ishido. Team F. Rikido Sato and Koji Kodai. Kyoka Jiro and Denki Kaminari make up Team G. Team H. Tsuyu Asui and Fumikage Tokiyami. Team I. Toru Hagakuri and Mashirao Ojiro. Team J. Eijiro Kirishima and Honda Siro. "Darn it," Kyoka said with sadness as she glanced down at her piece of paper. She hoped to be assigned to Izuku. "Ah, come on, beautiful, I'm not that bad." Denki smiled amiably at her and waved his hand. Just don't fry me, Thunderbolt." Kyoka glared at him, and the lad crumpled a little at her insult. With villains on his right and heroes on his left, All Might threw his hands into the boxes and exclaimed, "And now that everyone has teamed up, we will now select the first team to enter into the battle trial. The first teams to show us their stuff will be these guys." He presented Izuku's team, Team A, as the hero team and, to the boys' increasing dismay, Team D as the villain team, meaning he would be up against Katsuki Bakugo from the start. He looked over to see his old friend smirking at him, and he noticed a minor explosion off to his right. "If she gets scared, then don't let her watch, okay?" Izuku said with a sigh as he handed Eri to Kyoka. With concern in her eyes, Kyoka asked him, "All right, but are you gonna be okay with this?" Before All Might started outlining the exercise's goal, Izuku nodded slowly and stated, "I think I can handle him." He flexed his clawed fingers and said, "I have a healing factor, Plus I know how he fights, so I can make a strategy for myself and Shinso to at least take him out of the fight. If the fight looks like it's getting out of hand, I will step in, and I will stop both teams, All Might explained, pointing pointedly at teams A and D. Villain team, your objective is to protect the bomb from the hero team by either fending them off until the 15-minute timer runs out, or to capture the hero team by wrapping capture tape around them. His smile turned into a hard, frightening frown as his blue eyes shone from their shadowy sockets, making the two teams flinch. Even Katsuki wasn't completely unaffected. As he saw that the girl was hanging back with Izuku, he called out, "Hero team, your objective is to stop the villain team by touching the bomb, which means you have acquired the weapon, or capture the villain team. If time runs out and neither has been completed, it is an automatic failure for the hero team." He led Bakugo and Iida to one of the buildings and said, 10 minutes will be allowed to strategize for the coming battle. Everyone into positions, please. The rest of you, follow me to the observation room to await your turns, and while we watch the battle. Young Jiro, if you please. She shifted her gaze between them and then groaned in frustration. She then leaned up on her toes and turned to face him, kissing him exactly where his lips would be behind his mask. Gay. Izuku jerked and retreated in surprise. As she turned around and took Eri to the observation area, the flushed girl said, "Please don't do anything stupid, okay?" "Why yeah. Not stupid is good," Izuku said, raising his hand to his mask as he caught himself staring after her. Shinso put his hand on his shoulder and jolted him out of his reverie, saying, "Then you'd better get your head out of the clouds. And then you can help us figure out a way to win this thing." After shaking his head, Izuku said, "Right, sorry, okay, first of all, tell me about your quirk." Supaidaemon as they headed into the viewing area, Eri inquired, "Kyoka, are you mad?" "No, what makes you think that, sweetie?" the girl said, glancing at her. Eri made a frowning look that made her chuckle, and she blinked a few times before saying, "Well, your face is all red, and you had the mad face on. Did Daddy do something bad?" she asked. "No, he didn't, and I'm not mad at him, or anyone really," Kyoka said with a smile, "just worried. Daddy has to fight a really strong person, after all." Kyoka laughed and gave her a tight hug. Eri defiantly said, "But Daddy's strong," as she raised her small fists above her head. Although Kyoka couldn't deny it, she also couldn't deny that Bakugo would pursue him as a lion would a piece of meat. She responded, "You're right," as they walked into the observation room. In addition to a view of Midoriya and Shinso conversing directly outside the building, likely devising a strategy to counter their explosive classmate, it was packed with monitors that displayed the interior of the building that Bakugo and Iida were inhabiting. "Man, for Shinso to have to face Bakugo on his first day," she heard Toru say, "that's some serious bad luck." "Bakugo will be focused on Izuku," Kyoka added, addressing the unseen girl. "Those two have a history, and I doubt that he views Shinso as a real threat, or even Izuku for that matter." "So they're rivals? That's so manly," smiled Kirishima. Despite Kyoka's desire to deny it, the fact remained that this was a distorted rivalry between the two of them. "Forget about that for the next 5 minutes, Mina murmured, as Toru's gloves bounced next to her. The pink girl was grinning broadly, and she said, "We saw something I bet you thought we wouldn't see." In those obnoxious sing-song voices, Toru and Mina were saying, "Oh, it was so cute of you to kiss him for good luck." However, Kyoka's cheeks were already flushed with neon. Denki said, "Man, no wonder you didn't want to pair with me," with a somewhat disappointed expression. "It was so sweet. I had no idea you two were a couple," said Ochako, touching her cheeks. To the surprise of the girls, Kyoka yelled, we're not dating or anything," she murmured in complete humiliation. Naturally, the gunman who was least expected had to deliver the fatal blow. As the elder girl turned redder than usual and began spluttering more than Izuku usually did, Eri questioned, "Does this mean you really are my mommy?" Kyoka had nothing at all to defend her, and even Momo and Tsuyu swooned over that one. Supaidaemon Izuku gazed at Shinso in wonder and said, "Brainwashing?" after the boy described his quirk. "Yeah, my quirk probably isn't something you'd see as heroic, I know, but," Shinso said, turning away from him. Then Izuku roared, "That's incredible. You could be a great hero with a quirk like that," he said. "Hostage situations, suicide attempts, you could stop those easily just by talking to them." You're not afraid of my quirk?" Hitoshi asked in amazement. "You don't plan on using it on me, do you?" the spider questioned. "Why would I be?" "Well, not right this second," but Hitoshi said, scratching the back of his head. And don't tell me it's not a heroic quirk, Spider-Man replied. There's so much good you could do with it. All you have to do is choose. You want to be a hero using your quirk, right? Of course, replying the brainwasher. So what do you say? Ready to take that first step? Izuku said, lifting his mask to reveal his smiling face. Then you, Hitoshi Shinso, can be a hero. He smiled, and the other teen found himself suppressing his feelings. I wish someone had said those words to me years ago, but it never happened. Izuku went on, but recently, a teacher said that I didn't need a quirk to become a hero, and that I already was one. He put his mask back in place, his eyes sparkling once more. He extended his hand. Yeah. So, how do we beat these guys? Said Hitoshi, grabbing it. Izuku took a step back and examined the structure. Our biggest problem is gonna be Bakugo, he stated. His quirk is powerful and highly destructive. He never hesitates to use it inside or outside. And those gauntlets of his, I think, store up his sweat in large amounts, so, if he was desperate, he could fire off an enormous explosion. So we have to take him out first. Shinso questioned. Why did you say that he'd normally be the problem? Shinso noticed that Spider-Man was smiling broadly even through his mask as he simply gazed at him. He likes to talk, doesn't he? She asked. Spider-Man answered, he does, but he's not going to be your target, which confused the child. Wouldn't it have been preferable to simply eliminate him sooner rather than later? Normally, I'd say we need him out of the way first, but there's a chance that if we both fight him, he'd take us both out, the arachnid said. But he's most likely going to come after me, and ignore you completely, so I'll keep him busy long enough for you to find Iida and the bomb, that way you can get his attention and put the whammy on him. Grinning, Shinso said, did you just say whammy? Maybe, chuckled the arachnid. With their earpieces in, All Might declared, Hero Team, you may now enter the building. Good luck, my young students. Through a second-story window, the two youngsters entered the building. One was wearing body armor issued by the police, while the other was fully equipped in a state-of-the-art costume. If you can get close enough, slap one of these on his wrist, Izuku said, passing something to Hitoshi. It's a capture weapon that shuts down the wearer's quirk. There's a story there, the teenager said, nodding. I noticed your little girl wearing one, he remarked. She's got a dangerous quirk, and can't control it to the point of being terrified she's going to hurt someone, Izuku swiftly said. As soon as he entered the building, his spider sense activated, putting him on high alert. As they spoke, Katsuki was probably already moving to cut them off. He warned his teammate, watch out, he's coming for us. He grabbed his belt and opened one of the pouches to retrieve a web bomb. As they got closer to a turn in the hallway, he leaned himself against a wall and applied pressure to the priming. Then his spider sense went crazy. He yelled, get back, as Bakugo launched himself around the corner, raising one arm to detonate another explosion and extending the other out behind him. A wave of heat swept over them as Hitoshi was forced to the ground just as the explosion exploded. You alright? He said, Midoriya. Despite the smoke filling the room, he could see two individuals standing in front of him. Yeah, my suit held up, Before Izuku could fully recover, Katsuki was on the move and gave him another hammering to the chest. Before the explosive teenager gripped his left wrist and spun around at breakneck speed, using his explosions as thrusters, he felt something fracture in his chest, possibly a rib. Then, with enough power to crater the wall, he was thrown into the opposite wall. A burning pain shot through his chest, and he gasped, damn it, I think he just broke my ribs. As the green-haired teenager pulled himself away from the wall and stumbled a few paces, Katsuki sneered, not so tough, now, are ya, Deku? You seriously thought that just because you've got yourself a quirk now that you can compete with me? The ashen blonde strode forward, explosions crackling around his hands. Too bad you're just another bug for me to step on. Izuku gave him a scowl. He could immediately feel his bones healing, but more significantly, he was becoming irate. Actually, I'm an arachnid, he said. He glanced behind his old friend and said, you know the plan, Shinso, which made the blonde sneer at him. Find Iida and take him out. He was able to hold onto the web bomb and replied, I'll take care of Kachan myself. You sure about this? Shinso said, giving him a worried look as the explosive blonde, as Izuku had predicted, was concentrating all of his attention on his teammate and ignoring him totally for the time being. Considering the insane expression in the blonde's eyes, Shinso was relieved about it. Izuku looked at him resolutely and nodded. Okay, but your girlfriend said not to do anything stupid, remember? Shinso only gave him a despairing smirk. Without waiting for an answer, he stood up and ran around Bakugo, who didn't even bother to stop him. Pretty sure that this counts, but good luck anyway. Izuku pounced and threw the bomb at Bakugo as soon as he had left the battlefield. The vessel just exploded and dispersed the internal webbing all over him when he raised his hand and blasted it. "What the fuck?" exclaimed Bakugo. Izuku joked, "Toodles, Thunderbomb," and then he chased after Shinso. "Get back here, ya damn nerd!" Bakugo roared as he burned the webs with both fists and charged after him. As he turned the corner of the hall, Izuku grabbed his pouches once again and extracted 2 mines, throwing them into the walls. Strong electrical bolts erupted from them, shocking Katsuki as he flew straight into them. He yelled, "Gah! You bastard!" as he destroyed the walls. "I'ma kill you for that." Izuku's voice floated to him from the hallways in front of him, "But I'm still here, ya pyromaniac. You've been trying to do that for years, Kachan." Bakugo yelled, "Stop calling me Kachan," and then flashed a manic smile. "You already chose your hero name, right, Spider Freak?" he said. "Well, so have I. From now on, it's Plastique." Spider-Man laughed and remarked, "Plastic, huh? I hope you're at least recyclable." Growled Plastique, "Laugh all you want, you insect, but at least I'm out here in the open, and not hiding like some little bitch-ass bug like you." "Who's hiding?" Plastique spun around and was immediately struck in the face. He was struck with 11 years of suffering, which caused the pale blonde to fly down the hallway. Spider-Man launched 2 web lines into the walls before he hit the ground, then retreated to sling himself after him. By this point, Plastique was almost up, and the arachnid was powerless to stop him. "Crotch. Spider-Man, dude," exclaimed Kaminari, "that Hurricanrana was epic." "All Might, thanks so much for letting us in on the audio for this," Kyoka said with real joy, laughing herself silly. "I am never gonna let either one of them forget this." "I don't think anyone will." All Might laughed as he observed the conflicts take place. In actuality, Izuku might have been wise to allow Shinso to pursue Ida alone. Time was running out, and if they were both anywhere close to Bakugo, excuse the pun, Plastique, one or both of them would probably get hurt before the game ended. "Forget about the wrestling move," Toru huffed. He turned invisible again. "He's stealing my shtick." According to Suyu, frogs can camouflage, too, I think, Ribbit. Hanta Zero said, "They're at it again," with enthusiasm. Spider-Man Plastique was thrown to the ground by Spider-Man's flying Hurricanrana, but as soon as he rolled to his feet, he was moving again, vanishing with his newfound camouflage skills. "You fucking Deku," yelled Plastique, his eyes white with rage, into the deserted hallway. "This is what you were waiting for, wasn't it?" he yelled. "From the time we were kids, you've always looked down on me." Spider-Man cocked his head, obscured by the darkness, and his quirk, "Looked down on him?" Plastique went on, "You thought I was weak, that I needed your help, just because I fell down, you had to go and treat me like some weak little shit that needed saving." All of it suddenly returned to him. The day their relationship altered. At the creek that day. As he stood in front of him, the person who had once been his friend, he crept down from the ceiling, remaining concealed by his quirk until the very end. "That's what this is about?" he asked aloud, shaking his head in shock, as he swam into view and removed his mask. "That's why you decided to shun me? To beat me to within an inch of my life every day just to show that you could? That's what it's always been about, you fucking idiot." Plastique stared at him. With a satisfying crunch, Spider-Man's right fist slammed out in a clean blow to his nose. "Gah!" he exclaimed as the pale blonde fell to his knees, holding his face for a second in shock at having been hit. However, he was startled out of it by the blood streaming from his nose, and he scowled up at the arachnid before he faltered when he noticed a look of unadulterated anger on the boy's face that he had never seen before. Spider-Man yelled out and went at him, delivering a left cross to his cheek and then a roundhouse kick that sent him flying into the wall, creating a crater as he had done to him once before. "You stupid, egotistical moron," he exclaimed. "We were 4 years old, Kachan," he snapped. 4 years. That's younger than Eri is right now. And you've been pissed off all this time because I was worried that my friend who, at the time, had fallen off a log that was more than 10 feet from a shallow creek that had rocks at the bottom, and maybe cracked his head open, or broke his neck. Spider-Man approached him with a slow, determined pace, sparks of electricity jumping across his arms. "I didn't need," Plastique moaned as he drew himself away from the wall, but before he could say anything more, Spider-Man was on him. After putting his mask back on, Spider-Man surged forward and knocked Plastique down cold with a thundering right hook to the gut. He responded, however, with a strong point-blank blast to the chest that sent Spider-Man flying in all directions. His ears rang from the impact of the explosion, but his body also converted the attack's kinetic energy into more of the electrical charge he needed to finish this battle. All these years, you thought I was looking down on you. Spider-Man yelled as he ran at Plastique once more, rising into a squat and glaring at the explosive blonde. The lenses on Plastique's mask prevented the freckled teenager from going blind when he threw one of his grenades at him. The little explosive burst in a brilliant light. He leapt, web-slinging himself into a soaring kick that Plastique nearly missed. "You had it so wrong, you damned idiot," he exclaimed. Plastique snarled, "The hell I did." As he intensified his explosion, stun grenade, his hand erupted, causing the arachnid to fall against the wall again. "You were always making believe that you, a quirkless nothing, could be a hero," he yelled. "You even called me a villain once," he screamed at the teenager, "always getting in my way, telling me how to act." Electricity ignited in Spider-Man's right arm, beginning at the tips of his fingers and spreading up his arm before entering his chest. "That's because you acted like one," Plastique observed as his opponent pushed himself off the wall, spreading the green glow from his chest and back into both of his arms. "And what makes it worse," the trainee with the arachnid theme added angrily, "is that you couldn't see what you were doing. Listen to me, Bakugo." His opponent flinched. "I looked up to you," he snapped. "You were always better than me in school, so I admired you for that and tried my best to keep up with you because I knew that you would be amazing." Spider-Man's green eyes glowed brighter than ever as the emblems on his suit started to shine in the light emanating from inside of him. "But when you got your quirk, you started walking down a path I couldn't follow," he continued, stepping closer to the increasingly wary blonde. Plastique retorted, "Yeah, because you were quirkless." "No." Spider-Man lunged at him, and the hall erupted in green lightning. Before Plastique could defend himself, hundreds of millions of volts of electricity were sent through his body. He walked away. "That's just what the teachers said to encourage your aggression. They were turning you into a rabid animal that could bring them a bigger paycheck if someone with a strong quirk came from their school." The blonde growled back and threw himself at him once again. They saw that I was great," he said. The fight then intensified as both sides attempted to harm the other with strong electrical or explosive blasts. Supaidam and the remainder of the class watched in increasing amazement. Kirishima yelled, "Those two are amazing." As the fight went on, "I can barely follow some of their moves. But man, these two have issues." Denki nodded. "I can't follow them at all," he said, shivering. "Did you hear some of the stuff they were saying?" he asked. "I have a fairly good idea why Midoriya has so many scars across his body," Tokiyami commented as he observed the battle. "Both hearts have their own darkness in them, though one still has a light shining through the dim." While young Eri watched the battle with increasing concern, Kyoka struggled to contain her wrath at the situation. She shouted out, "Daddy's hurt," as Bakugo slammed Izuku face down on the ground, sending an explosion straight into his back. However, as Izuku fled, the green light of his bioelectricity burst out of his body in a tremendous surge that briefly sent the pale blonde crashing against the ceiling. After that, the two started fighting, hitting each other repeatedly. Izuku received an elbow to the face, but the violet-haired girl distracted her with a kind pat on the back and said, "Remember, he's strong, right? Come on, half pint, your dad's not gonna let that puffed-up cherry bomb beat him." Through a mouth on one of his tentacle arms, Mezzo Shoji remarked, "Very strong. I haven't seen many pros take as much damage as these two are taking, but I'll be damned if they can't dole it out, either. Your ego is the only wonderful thing about you right now," Izuku yelled abruptly. "Spiderman, I'll prove just how great I am, you punk." Plastique shouted in the boy's ear as he imprisoned Spider-Man in a sleeper hold and tried to render him unconscious. "I'll squash you just like the bug you are." Reaching a hand back toward Plastique's face, Spider-Man snarled and said, "The only thing great about you now," curling his finger with sparks of electricity around it, "is your ego." He flicked his finger, sending a tremendous discharge through the tip of his nose into the blonde's face. Spider-Man's elbows went straight to his stomach as his grip relaxed. "You don't know how disappointed I was in seeing you act like a monster." He snapped, and struck the stunned teenager in the chest with another discharge after whirling his knee all the way to the solar plexus. "When we were kids, you were the brother I always wanted." The teenager yelled at the astonished blonde, "We were family. And you threw it all away just because some money-hungry teacher stroked your pride." Plastique was rapidly losing steam when one of his grenadier bracers chimed and turned red. "You want a monster," he yelled, lifting his right arm as he revealed the pin by pulling back the grenade's handle. Then I'll show you a monster. Spiderman. Oh god, Kyoka exclaimed as she watched the blonde pointing his bracer at Izuku. Stop the fight right now, or he'll bring the whole building down. She turned to All Might. Young Bakugo, stop, he yelled into the microphone, with the support of All Might. You'll kill him. However, he was disregarded when Bakugo removed the pin from his weapon and let loose a torrent of hellfire into the building's cramped hallways. The students heard Spider-Man ask, what kind of a hero tells someone to commit suicide? As he was lost in the stream of flames created by Plastique's support gear. That was the last thing they heard. Spiderman. Plastique's aim was thrown off by only a few centimeters to his right as Spider-Man spoke, giving the arachnid ample space to flatten himself against the wall and avoid the incoming blast as it blasted through the hall, tearing apart the walls as it hit. Fortunately, the insulated suit shielded him from the heat, and the flames swiftly passed him. His electrical powers surged from the energy he absorbed from the blast, and he was on the move as soon as they passed. When Plastique saw him unhurt, she was too shocked to respond. Spider-Man gumming up the mechanism too much to use it, he fired both web shooters at the handle as he elevated the left bracer. Then he ripped off the bracer and yanked the web line. Plastique charged at him in rage. Snatching up one of his handcuffs, Izuku placed it over the blonde's extended arm. Unaware of the device, Plastique attempted to blow it off, only to be startled to discover that his quirk had stopped functioning. What the foo? A web shot to his mouth silenced him. The teenager pulled off the second bracer, began webbing his arms to his sides, and struggled to get the thing off as Spider-Man charged forward. Spider-Man leapt to the ceiling, launched 2 additional web lines at Plastique's shoulders to hoist him into the air, and began to cocoon him. You know, Plastique, you're looking a little tired, he joked. Why don't you stick around here for a while and rest? MPH. His old friend Bully from boyhood was hanging upside down, writhing to attempt to get free from the strong webs, and gazing angrily at the arachnid. Spider-Man retreated and marveled at his creation, saying, oh, what a tangled web we've woven, Plastique. He laughed and said, now, I'd love to hang around with you, but I've got a test to win. As he left and vanished up the stairs, one might assume that the teen had won flawlessly, but he performed a little, happy dance, for himself, which made some people laugh. Well done, Spidey, Spiderman. With a stunning smile on her face, Eri exclaimed, he won. Daddy won. Daddy won. Kyoka couldn't stop laughing at Izuku's little dancing routine. Gosh, I really want to make fun of him right now. Opening square bracket closing square bracket. Kirishima yelled, that fight was the most manly I've ever witnessed. Kaminari exclaimed, dude seriously put him down. With an astute nod, Tokiyami said, light triumphed over the darkness. With a sigh of relief, All Might continued to gaze at the young man he had grown fond of and remarked, well done, young Midoriya. He noticed that the young man was leaning on the walls for support. Not missing the gesture, Momo looked at Kyoka and asked, do you think he'll be able to help Shinso if it comes to a fight? It looks like that fight took a lot out of him, though. Kyoka shrugged and said, I don't even know what Shinso can do, reminding the girl that it's possible that he may defeat Iida by alone. In the interim, when Shinso discovered Iida, he was talking to himself about how he would be the greatest villain he could be. It was fortunate that he had a good sense of humor because the speedster's words and actions would have made him chuckle. All Might declared, Katsuki Bakugo has been captured and is no longer a participant in the test. Good job, Midoriya. As Iida turned to face the weapon, he pondered. All right, it's time to repay him for saving my neck from that crazy bomber. I only hope he's as credulous as I believe him to be. Excuse me, but where's the toilet? He said as he emerged from concealment. Iida stopped in the middle of her sentence, I'm sorry, wah. Shinso put his palm on the side of the fake bomb and waltzed right up to it, smiling and saying, bingo. We have caught the bomb. The hero squad wins. Izuku had to be escorted back to the observation room by Shinso. He was slowly healing from bruises on all of his ribs, half of which were fractured. Right away, All Might told him to go straight to Recovery Girl. Shinso was appalled at the harm done to him as the nurse took off his costume. His face, chest, and back were all almost completely bruised. Recovery Girl said that the substantial damage to his body was causing him to heal more slowly, and that it was fortunate that Izuku's quirk provided a regenerative healing factor since otherwise, the damage may have been fatal. Then Bakugo, who was nearly as awful as Izuku, was introduced. He appeared to have some internal injuries, his nose was obviously shattered, and his arms were fractured all the way up to his shoulders. The brainwashing youngster said, "Man, you two really did a number on each other," and volunteered to assist the nurse in dressing the two of them. "I have half a mind to let you two hooligans heal naturally," sniffed Recovery Girl as she huffed, though that wouldn't do much in Mr. Midoriya's case, as he should heal on his own within a day and a half. Bakugo tilted his head toward him and moaned angrily, "What the hell? What kind of quirk do you have, anyway? So you admit that I actually have one, now," Izuku snorted. The child then moaned in agony, and the blonde simply growled at him from his bed. Shinso positioned himself between them and yelled, "Stop fighting, you two. The match is over." Bakugo growled, "Don't tell me what to," after him. Shinso used his quirk to get the boy to fall back into his bed and begin snoring, saying, "Sleep." As his partner turned to face him, Izuku laughed and remarked, "He's not gonna be happy about that." Shinso shrugged. Shinso smirked and said, "What can I say? The guy needed a nap." "Good boy," smiled the boy at him. Izuku said, "Sleep." The youngster sank back against the bed, sound sleeping, his eyes glazing over. Then Shinso turned to face Recovery Girl and smiled, saying, "That should make your job a little easier. I should hire you on as an assistant," the Recovery Girl joked, laughing as the infirmary door swung open and a new patient was carried in. The old nurse turned to the young man and groaned, rolling her eyes and saying, "Oh, here we go again. Mind staying a bit longer?" she said. "I might as well help," said Shinso with a shrug. By the time Izuku awoke once more, a third of his class had moved into the infirmary. According to Recovery Girl, it was bad enough that any of them were hurt, but no one was nearly as terribly hurt as he and Bakugo had been. Bakugo was still unconscious when Izuku and Shinso were cleared to resume class. They arrived just in time to see the following match, in which Ojiro and Hagakure were playing the villain team and Shoto Todoroki and Mezzo Shoji were playing the hero team. Eri exclaimed, "Daddy," when she spotted him during the time that Kyoka had let Mina hold her. Naturally, as soon as the young girl reached out to him, he was at their side. While wearing a smile, Mina let out a regretful, "Ah," when Eri was pulled from her. "That was some match, Midoriya," the pink-skinned girl muttered as Eri held onto him. "I'll say it was," Kyoka remarked, giving the youngster a slight scowl. "Didn't I say not to do anything stupid?" Of all things, Izuku dared to pose as his daughter. "In my defense, I had everything under control," he continued, but his voice was trembling, which did not support his position. After giving him a sidelong glance and waving her arms in front of him, Kyoka said, "You have a little girl to think about, broccoli brain. You don't get to make stupid choices like baiting a guy that is a walking stick of dynamite into a fight like that." When All Might announced that the next match was about to begin, all eyes were on the contestants. When Todoroki moved forward, the entire building was covered with ice, making the observation area extremely frigid. As she trembled, Ochako questioned, "Isn't that a little much?" She wished she had considered making her costume more insulated from the cold or less form-fitting. Izuku stepped forward and put his free arm around her, drawing her in to experience the warmth his bioelectricity offered, while Kyoka caressed her shoulders. She blushed, but she took the warmth he gave her as All Might declared the match's winners. Nobody was shocked when Todoroki was announced as the game's MVP when the teams returned to the observation room. Momo stepped up and presented some blankets she had made to poor Ojiro and Toru. Since Shoji wasn't as near the ice when it formed, he declined the offer. The invisible girl was wrapping the blanket around herself and hopping up and down in place to warm herself. As her teeth chattered, the girl whimpered, "Man, that was totally a cheat. What if I get frostbite from this?" She yelled at the ice-covered teenager, her bare feet slamming on the floor. "It's not fair to just freeze everything without even letting us defend ourselves." Shoto murmured plainly, "Then you should wear more clothes." The girl simply yelled in frustration. In response, Shoto simply grunted. Now, young Hagakure," All Might laughed, while a bit excessive, young Todoroki acted within the parameters of the exercise. He turned to face the boy and said, "However, young Todoroki, next time you work with a partner, it may be beneficial to actually formulate a plan with said partner." Eri squinted at him and said, "He sounds like Uncle Baku." It takes a child to relieve all the tension in the room, for even All Might burst out laughing as soon as she said it. "Hey, Midoriya, I wanted to ask you something about your fight," the invisible girl remarked, laughing as she made her way up to Izuku. I saw you use something on Bakugo that I think made his quirk unusable. What was that? She asked. Ah, that must have been the new power cuffs that I've heard so much about, All Might responded, as the students turned to face him. From what Mr. Yagi's told me, young Midoriya designed a device that can completely nullify a person's quirk when worn. He pointed to Eri's wrist and said, if I'm not mistaken, little Eri is wearing one right now. Daddy gave this to me, Eri exclaimed happily, pointing to the gadget and asking, isn't it pretty? As she glanced down at the band on her wrist. With a delighted yet urgent tone, Toru danced in place and exclaimed, do you have one I could wear? Before she could finish, Izuku reached into his utility belt and took out one of the bands. Please, I could pay you back if, she said. As she grabbed it from him, he said, it has a thumbprint pad on it. Let it scan yours so you can take it off whenever you want before slapping it on. That's exactly what she did. She smacked the band around her wrist after the red lights on it changed from red to blue. After a brief period of intermittent blinking, the blue light became green. The wrist emerged from the place of contact, thin and alabaster. Her shoulder and forearm came next. More of herself appeared, and Toru squeaked in surprise. Ojiro said, oh, wow, as the girl gazed down at her hands. With a quivering voice, the girl questioned, reaching up to her face where tears were welling up in her eyes, does anyone have a mirror? Momo took a hand mirror from her arm and moved forward. She gave it to the girl with a smile. She noticed lengthy waves of disheveled, chartreuse-colored hair when she held the mirror up to herself. Large, round, teal or yellow eyes with bushy lashes above them. She exhaled, oh, I'm, actually kinda, pretty, she said. Denki smiled and said, not just kinda, you're a complete knockout. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Toru shrieked joyfully as Eri chuckled and Izuku flushed. She then lunged at Izuku and put her arms around his neck. Kyoka simply smiled at the sight, a tiny twinge of jealousy piercing her heart, but everything went awry when the blanket enclosing the once invisible girl broke free. All Might's squawks of embarrassment, wolf whistles, shrieks, and loud laughter immediately filled the viewing room. Spiderman. Notwithstanding Toru's inadvertent striptease, the rest of the class went by without any problems. Izuku was happy to be able to observe Kyoka's match and was not shocked when the girl quickly identified the opposing team and used a sound attack to knock them out. It goes without saying that she won the MVP award for her match. To help them realize where they needed to improve, each student was given footage from their own matches to watch. All Might was now in the staff office with Aizawa and Sekijiro-kan, also known as Vlad King, the homeroom teacher for Class 1B. I've got to say that you have some talent in this class, Aizawa, the blood user said reluctantly as they went over the footage from the battle trials. The son of Endeavor, the heiress of the Yaoyorozu family that has a unique creation quirk, and the next speedster in the Iida family. He gave the shabby teacher a half-hearted glare, saying, if I didn't know any better, I'd say that the principal was playing favorites. During the first bout between Bakugo and Midoriya, Aizawa paused the action and shook his head. Believe me, I have plenty of students that would do better under your teaching, he stated. These two in particular. The hero of blood laughed. Ah, I remember these boys, Khan replied. One broke the combat point record at just over 70, while the other scored well over 50 rescue points, but barely had any combat points, though not for lack of effort. Katsuki Bakugo and Izuku Midoriya, Toshinori stated with a sigh, former childhood friends until the latter was diagnosed as quirkless, while the former developed a powerful quirk, and was praised to the point that his ego became bigger than Might Towers. Aizawa was completely in agreement with the shrunken hero for once. He said, it would have been safer for both of them if they'd been placed in different classes, before allowing the video to play, showing the three of them flinching at every blow the two teenagers exchanged. These two have something to prove to each other, one wanting to be the very best, and the other just wanting to live out his dream, and prove that he belongs here. And one of them turned into an incredibly vicious bully, Khan stated with a nod of his head, I understand why you think he'd do better in my class. He looked at both of them, our classes may be competitive with each other, but I know how to curb such an attitude. And you honestly are the best to teach Midoriya if what I've heard about his lack of confidence is all true. Toshinori laughed bloodily and said, Khan, when this kid doesn't have his mask on, he's a stuttering, muttering mess of a boy. As he spit up blood and wiped it away with a handkerchief. But, he grinned, that boy has one of the kindest hearts I've ever come across, plus he's got a decent head on his shoulders, although he seems to have a lack of restraint that rivals even Bakugo's. Aizawa scowled at the man and said, lack of restraint. He's been pretty subdued unless that little girl of his is concerned. Toshinori started, when it comes to tenacity, that boy does not quit, even if he knows that he could lose, and quite badly I might add. Both teachers looked to the blonde man for an explanation. When he fought with Rappa, he was clearly outmatched, and in a big way, but he just kept getting back up, he sighed. I saw that in the papers, Khan replied with a nod. I honestly felt a little impressed that he held his own for so long. Reaching into his pocket, Aizawa produced one of the power cuffs and nodded, saying, I've seen some of the tech he's designed. These in particular are quite ingenious for a student of his age. He handed it to Khan, adding, not only does it work as a quirk dampener, but it completely blocks the quirk off from being used. And it's safe for long-term use. The battery is charged from the wearer's body heat, allowing some of the inmates wearing them to be held in regular cells for low-level thugs. Recalling how Bakugo had stormed back into the classroom and demanded that the thumbprint Izuku had used on him be taken off, Toshinori laughed and remarked, and they won't come off unless a designated person removes them with a thumbprint. We actually had a bit of a snafu over them. How so? Inquired Aizawa. Well, as you know, one of our students, young Hagakure, has a permanently active invisibility quirk, Toshinori continued, and when she found out about the cuffs, and what they could do, she practically begged young Midoriya to let her have one. He laughed. Young Midoriya handed one to her, and allowed her to slap it on without a second though. He sipped on his coffee. Unfortunately, he didn't know that her costume only consisted of a pair of gloves and a pair of shoes. You mean she was, Khan said, his eyes widening. With a nod, Toshinori said, naked as a newborn baby. Luckily she had a blanket provided by young Yaoyorozu to cover up with before too much was seen. He laughed. You should have seen their faces. Poor Midoriya nearly fainted while Hagakure was terrified that young Jiro was going to strangle her with her earphone jacks. And Bakugo. Even Aizawa snorted a little at that. Well, you've both gotten your reports from Nezu, right? Toshinori sighed deeply and rubbed the back of his neck. They both nodded in agreement. Then you already know what he's like. He's been taking therapy sessions with Hound Dog because he's overly aggressive, right? Khan inquired as Aizawa said, beyond that I wasn't made aware of his reasons since he was placed in 1A. Aizawa looked at him. Basically, that bullying we mentioned was beyond what normal bullying is, said he. I had to stop him from outright attacking Midoriya when I gave them their quirk apprehension tests. Having not seen the occurrence, Toshinori questioned, what caused that? Aizawa sighed. Basically he thought the boy was quirkless until he saw it with his own eyes, which made him angry, well, angrier. He rephrased, plus, he hated whenever someone got a better score than he did. Yaoyorozu, Uraraka and Midoriya beat his score by leaps and bounds in the ball throw. But the minute he saw Midoriya's score, he lost it. If I hadn't been nearby, or if he hadn't activated a ternary quirk, Bakugo could have seriously injured him. Toshinori scowled and knelt down. Young Tokiyami mentioned that young Midoriya has plentiful and heavy scarring across his upper body, Toshinori said, as the two men stared at the blonde in disbelief. And he wasn't exactly subtle about who he thought was responsible. Pointing to the video they were viewing, Aizawa said, and we have hard evidence that he's done worse. Khan glared at his two friends and said, remind me why this boy hasn't been expelled, yet. So not only is the boy naturally violent, but he also has a massive superiority complex and highly is disrespectful to anyone that he thinks is weaker than he is, which includes teachers, he said, palming his face in frustration. And if we kick him out, then there's no hero school out there that would accept him. So there's a huge possibility that he could become a vigilante, or worse, a villain. Aizawa shrugged. Nezu thinks that we can break him of this behavior, and Toshinori nodded. I'd hate to imagine the damage he could do if he went rogue on us. Besides, Toshinori murmured, it's not like he's openly hostile with all of the students, not physically, anyway. Just Midoriya, Khan replied, that should be enough. Aizawa reminded the two of them, he's also hostile towards Jiro, but he shook his head and continued, but it's not enough for others to stand up to him. Not just by any student, either. He looked at the other two and said, it has to be Midoriya. But I will say that girl gives as good as she gets because she does not put up with his bullying at all. Khan complained and screamed, why does it have to be him? He remembered seeing the youngster strolling through the hallways with his daughter perched on his shoulders. The boy's good, but he has enough on his plate without us planning to throw him to the wolves. And then there's the trauma we could cause to his little girl. Aizawa returned his focus to the footage. It has to be Midoriya because Bakugo is fixated on him, that's why. He glanced at Kon. You said it yourself, didn't you? This kid has a superiority complex on a massive scale, and Midoriya when unmasked has a severe inferiority complex. He's just as bad as Bakugo in the reverse sense. He continued, we may not be able to reverse all of the damage done to these two, but we may be able to level it out. Toshinori said, I don't know, Aizawa, and the blonde man groaned. Pitting them against each other was nearly a fatal mistake on my part, and that was just by chance. Kon smiled at Aizawa. He's right, Aizawa. Bakugo used unnecessary force against Midoriya in an enclosed space that could have resulted in not only a death, but severe injury to the other students present at the time. Kon stated, and then sighed, but I can't say that I don't see the reason. Put two tigers in the same area, and both of them will try to either take the other out, or, in the best case scenario, duke it out until they find out that they can live in harmony. Alright, but how do we do it? Toshinori asked after giving it some attention and realizing that what they were discussing made some sense. Aizawa's words, off the books, captured their attention. If we do this in front of a class, that'll only make a spectacle out of the whole thing, he added. And all it would take is one student with a phone to post it on the web, then we have a newscaster catastrophe on our hands. So we offer them a chance to clear the air? Asked Kon, nodding. Then he looked at Aizawa and said, after the sports festival, Training Ground Omega, and, provided that the festival doesn't solve the problem for us, the families will witness it. Or duke it out like a pair of alphas, Toshinori said, scowling before palming his face. This is going to get messy, but it might be our best shot. With a startled expression on his face, Kon said, that's going a little far, isn't it? Their parents surely wouldn't. You haven't met the Bakugos, Toshinori replied. I've only spoken with them at length, but the boy's mother sounds like a female version of him, minus the explosions. I can agree with part of that, Aizawa replied. But still, allowing the parents to watch the boys potentially beat each other bloody. He raised his eyebrows, they may not like that much. Toshinori scowled as she considered how Inko had endured due to her husband's absence and Katsuki Bakugo's treatment of her son. Giving her justice was going to be accomplished in this way. Spiderman. In the meantime, there was a commotion in the home of Izuku Midoriya as the professors were formulating their strategy. I can't believe the cameras caught that. Izuku moaned, covering his face in shame, as he, his parents, and the Jiros watched his battle trial versus Bakugo and his final little dance performance. I am so never letting you live this down, Green Bean, you know that, right? Kyoka, who was sitting next to him with Eri in between them, said with a big smile. The only thing better than seeing your happy dance was seeing that puffed up firecracker get what was coming to him. I have to agree with Kyoka, sweetie, Inko remarked, nodding firmly as the two gazed at her. Katsuki had a lot of that coming. With a faint scowl on her face, she crossed her arms and said, especially considering how long this has been going on. Izuku sighed and leaned back. Yeah, but I don't think I was able to get through to him, he said, frowning. He still thinks I was, looking down on him this entire time. I wouldn't worry about it, Kyoka informed him, shaking her head. He's not someone I'd want as a friend, or even near me. Izuku sighed and pointed to the screen as Bakugo was ready to remove the pin on his gauntlet. You don't know him like I used to, he said. He was good back then, but all that praise the teachers loaded on him just turned him into that. With a look on her face that he couldn't read, Kyoka winced and added, you scared me half to death when that happened. She blushed slightly as she said, after you warned me about him being able to bring down a building with one of those things, I almost lost my mind. The night might have been enlivened by Izuku's own blush. I know, and I'm sorry. That reminds me, Inko replied, Mr. Toshinori came by not long ago, and gave us a contract for you to look over. Contract, the youngster said, turning to face his mother. Hisashi remarked, somewhat proudly, I let your mother make the decisions over the contents, so everything should be to your benefit. For those power cuffs of yours, he said, apparently he wants them freely available to the police, and for public use. His mother answered, I left it on your desk, sweetie. Not even a licensed hero, and he's already rolling in dough, Kyotoku laughed, grinning into his daughter's eyes. I could almost approve, he exclaimed. Their daughter merely stared at him, but Mika smirked and said, almost. Scowling, Izuku asked, approve of what? The girl sighed, nothing, but then she saw that Eri was starting to fall asleep. She grinned and said, come on, Munchkin, it's time for bed. She rose from the couch and lifted the young girl. Izuku rose to follow her. The parents watched with knowing smiles from Mika and Inko as their kids carried the young girl upstairs to bed. Do you mind if I go back a few scenes? That crotch move was classic, the look on the other kid's face. Kyotoku said with a smile as he picked up the remote control. Hisashi smiled and said, go ahead, I want to see that myself. Izuku pulled the covers over Eri as Kyoka was just tucking her into bed upstairs. Before her head struck the pillow, she was already sound asleep. Izuku remarked softly, I thought she would have been scared to death today, but she handled it a lot better than I ever thought possible. She's stronger than you think, Kyoka said, taking a step back and grinning at Izuku's adoring expression as he gazed down at his daughter. You should have seen her cheering you on in the observation room, she stated to the kid, it was adorable. I don't think anyone was rooting for you as much as she was. Her heart pounded against her ribs as Izuku gazed at her with the same smile. What about you? He asked. What about me? Kyoka asked, blushing a little. Izuku turned to face her and said, please, don't play games with me, now. He stepped closer to her and added, Ayan, that kiss was, in a begging tone. We've known each other for months and by now, even I can tell that there's something between us. Kyoka took a step back, yeah, I know. She scowled and started to spin one of her jacks around her fingers, saying, listen. Izuku, Izuku got closer to her before she could blink, raising his left palm to her face. Both teenagers were inexperienced with kissing. The only kiss Kyoka had ever given her parents was on the cheeks. The only boy she had ever desired to kiss and the first boy she had ever kissed was Izuku. Nothing fancy like what she had read in the romance novels she secretly kept in her closet, Izuku was only touching her with his lips. However, the well-known spark was undoubtedly present, literally. Kyoka yelled, ouch, when she felt the electrical charge move between their lips, hardly able to control her scream. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Izuku yelled, his face burning crimson, looking completely frightened out according to fashion. Are you okay? With one hand lifted to her still tingling lips, Kyoka gazed at him, her cheeks as scarlet as his, before quietly laughing. Wow, I never thought you were supposed to feel an actual spark when you kissed someone you liked. A tiny smile tugged at Izuku's lips. So then, he asked. Before taking his hands and guiding him out into the hallway, she put a finger to his lips to temporarily calm him. With a gentle click, Eri's room door closed. In a mockingly reprimanding tone, she then grinned up at him and added, what if Eri had woken up and seen us? You really should have known better than that. I claim momentary insanity. Izuku quietly scratched the back of his neck and said, causing the girl to chuckle once more. Well, it's true, it's been hard to think straight because of you lately. Before she stepped up and put her arms around his chest, Kyoka gave him a quick, loving glance. Then you need more practice, she whispered against his chest. And, to answer your, sorta question, her face clouded once more. She heard his heartbeat quicken and said, yeah, I do like you, like a lot. Her jacks twitched with pleasure. I try not to show it, but I kinda get crazy jealous when the other girls get too close, or flirt with you. I'm honestly flattered, Izuku said, laughing, and wrapped his arms around her. But you don't need to be jealous. She glanced up at him angrily and said, are you kidding me? I'm the only girl in class that has an AA cup, and a stick figure. She tried to move away, but he grabbed her closer. She trembled as he replied in a low voice, I don't care about any of that. Yes, I find the rest of the girls in our class attractive, she muttered, huffing and turning her head away from him. But I'm not attracted to them. How did this husky-voiced Casanova wannabe become this stuttering, nerdy mess of a teenage boy? Give it time, she mumbled, biting her lip and avoiding eye contact with him. You'll want someone else with a better body than me soon enough. But, I like your body. Izuku scowled at her, and she turned back to him, her eyes wide. To demonstrate his argument, he traced her form with his hands down her sides. Sure, you're slim, but you have curves, he said. His hands brushed just past the hem of her shirt, causing goosebumps to tingle her skin. Yo your chest, it's perfect. She whispered, sneering, "You say that when Yaomomo has a C cup." She was not prepared for one of those hands on her waist to rise up and slowly move up her body, but she did half expect him to begin talking about appropriate proportions. He paused, pressing his hand against her ribcage and staring into her eyes as she gave him a startled look. He was requesting her consent in silence. Her head bobbed gently in a very faint nod as her gaze slid down toward his hand. He raised his hand. As his fingers palmed her breast through the thin cotton of her shirt, she let out a gasp and covered her lips with her hand to keep her voice low. He jerked his hand away. He inquired in a somewhat panicked tone, "Did I hurt you?" Despite her fiery crimson face, Kyoka shook her head. "I'm just a little sensitive." Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of a tiny smile flickering across his lips before his hand returned. As he rubbed her, he whispered, "Perfect." As he went on, Kyoka's legs shook until her constraint gave way. Then she reached for him, bringing his head back down to her lips. Her fingers twisted into his wild hair as his arms around her to keep her in place as hers encircled his neck. The two teenagers froze, ahem. Together, they turned toward the top of the stairs, and to their embarrassment, her mother was standing there. Sadly for both of them, Izuku's quirk tended to go haywire whenever he got flustered, and being caught by your girlfriends. Mother during a makeout session was more than enough to do the trick. His hands literally stuck to her shirt, followed by the sound of ripping fabric. "Mom," Kyoka squeaked before pushing away from Izuku, her back thumping loudly against the wall. How long have you?" As her daughter's shirt hung limply from Izuku's flailing hands and Kyoka attempted to conceal both her purple bra and her navel, Mika's hand lifted to her mouth and she exclaimed, "Oh my." She was hardly able to contain her laughter at the sight before her. "Izuku," yelled Kyoka. "Sorry," he said, his hands flying in all directions and waving the t-shirt remains like a flag. Kyotoku cried out, "Kyoka." The girl said, "Fine. We're totally fine. The only reason you're fine is because of the fact that you didn't decide to go braless." Mika scoffed as she walked forward and took off her jacket, then slung it over her shoulders. "And Izuku." The mother was leaning toward him when the unfortunate youngster jumped to attention. "I approve." She smiled at him and said, "Just try not to give me any grandchildren for a few more years, all right?" He stumbled, does Eri count?" Mika laughed and started dragging her daughter downstairs, saying, "Now, come along. This little wardrobe snafu isn't going to fix itself. Only if she starts calling Kyoka mommy." Spiderman, a slender, pale young man walked into the gloomy laboratory and asked, "Doctor?" Large liquid-filled tubes and bodies in various states of decay were all around him. He wasn't certain. He only knew that the doctor had something that he desired and needed. Something floating in one of the tubes at the moment. He came to a halt before the thing within. "Hello." He looked at the powerful monster inside and grinned thinly. It was huge, with skin as black as tar, and several 100 pounds heavier than him. On top of its head was an exposed brain, and beneath it was a big, beak-like mouth with sharp teeth. "Nomu." "Tamura," the physician asked as he rounded a bend in one of the tubes. "Ah, it is you." He grinned at the individual. "Good, I've been expecting you. How are the preparations for our little field trip?" Tamura's beady crimson eyes glowed as he grinned at the man. "We have everything we need," he replied, putting his hand on the container's smooth surface. "Everything, except for this." The man simply twirled his mustache and said, "I'm happy that you think my child here will be the deciding factor," grinning. "But there has been a change in the roster." Tamura gave him a manic glint in his eyes and said, "This Nomu is now obsolete toward your little venture, but never fear, for I have something better for you to take along." He said, "Do you, now?" With a smile, the doctor motioned for him to come along. He pointed to a cage with the number 6 on it to his right and said, "You see, my boy, recently I have been experimenting with the blood samples I took from my side project." As Tamura looked inside and was glared at by 6 crimson eyes, he stated, "You can see part of the result here. This fellow is stronger than the Nomu I had planned to send with you before, but he doesn't follow orders as well as I'd like unless I give them." Tamura growled, "Then he's useless to me," and the beast within sprang at the bars, causing the cage to tremble as 6 clawed arms grabbed for him and green, acidic drool poured from its mandibles. The doctor grinned broadly and said, "I worked myself to the bone until I had the perfect son." He then proceeded to show a number of cages containing similar creatures, some slightly more human than others. "And then I replicated him." He stopped in front of a pair of life support pods and pressed a button, causing the pods to hiss open. Two large, burly monsters lumbered out from inside. He pointed to the creature on his right, both of them larger than number 6, and said, "Let me introduce you to my arachnoids, number 7, and here we have number 8. Totally obedient, merciless, and deadlier than any Nomu I've ever created," he said. As poison trickled from their jaws, Tamura questioned suspiciously, "And these will be able to kill All Might?" "Oh, these fellows aren't for All Might, mind you that I wouldn't dismiss them taking him down as powerful as they are," he quickly replied. "But they will be going with you. And so shall I." Tamura gave him a startled look and said, "You, doctor?" He smiled proudly at the two stoic creatures and said, "Someone has to control my boys. And UA is a treasure trove of untapped resources I can't possibly pass up." He smiled and took a picture of a small, white-haired girl from his coat. "Also, I have been asked by the local Yakuza to retrieve something for them." His eyes glinted viciously behind his glasses as he said, "And using her quirk. I think I can expand my Nomus's abilities tenfold." "Well, then, who am I to deny you when you sound so excited?" replied Tamura. The media was despised by Hisashi Midoriya. In addition to their inability to accept no, reporters and photographers frequently created more trouble than the shady villains he had faced during his vigilante days. That had been the same this morning, when a crowd of reporters had gathered at the school's gates, forcing Present Mike, Eraserhead, and himself to the front to keep them out. A courageous reporter had attempted to force her way inside, triggering the school's defenses and almost losing her a fortune. However, it had temporarily resolved the reporter's issue. One of the metal plates that served as a barrier to keep people out was discovered by Hisashi when he was walking about the campus, rusted and turned to dust. Before reporting it to Nezu, he brought a sample to the forensic science class for analysis. Aside from the reporters barking outside the walls to see All Might, he told the smart animal, "The only anomaly I've found would be the corroded steel gate which forensics said was the work of someone's quirk." He said as he read the report, "Do any of the reporters that were here today have a quirk that can do something like that?" With a deep frown on his mammalian face, the principal shook his head and said, "I'm afraid that I don't know, but I can assure you that I will be looking into it. Those reporters caused quite a ruckus, and I can't have such things happening on my campus, especially since it caused a panic during the lunch period. Some students were almost trampled." Hisashi seemed happy with his son's handling of the matter, nodding, "I'd heard about that," and then grinning, "Apparently Izuku was the one that stopped it." "Indeed, your son is shaping up to be a fine young hero in the making, Hisashi," remarked the rodent. "He was recently made the class representative alongside Miss Yaoyorozu, a fine upstanding young lady, if I'm not mistaken." Hisashi scowled and said, "I hope that doesn't cause any friction between him and Kyoka," mainly to himself while the principal gave him a glance. "Those two have become pretty close since entering UA, and little Eri adores her like a mother." Nezu gave an understanding nod. "If that's the case, then I understand your worry, but I feel that it's not necessary." He grinned, "If the rumors I've been hearing lately have any truth to them, then your son and Miss Jiro are the school's new power couple." Hisashi laughed. "That's a good thing. Inko's been hoping they'd get together for a while," said him. "Anyway, that's my report. I'll check the security footage for anything I might have missed." "A moment before you go," Nezu replied, "I'd like to ask if you'd mind subbing for one of our teachers in a few days' time." Hisashi arched an eyebrow at the rodent and questioned incredulously, "Really? You want me to teach your students?" The principal said, "Technically, you are a part of UA's staff and all of our staff members have a responsibility to teach our students," and Nezu nodded joyfully. With his arms crossed, the ex-mercenary questioned sarcastically, "And how many of your teachers were once vigilantes?" The principal simply grinned at him, "I know that you believe you haven't the right to teach these children, but I've watched you while you trained with your son and Miss Jiro in martial arts." He pointed out, "Not only do you take care to not harm them during your sparring sessions, but you take the time to explain the movements during the spar, instead of letting them make fools of themselves as some of our other teachers do." Hisashi sighed, "That's because I have street smarts," and continued, "Most of your teachers haven't had their noses to the pavement in years." "I will admit that," Nezu grumbled, "aside from All Might or Aizawa, most of the teachers don't work the streets as they did in their heydays." He grinned at the previous vigilante. "You, however, are unique among them in that you fight as a hero, but you also know how to fight against other heroes." "To my great regret," whispered Hisashi. The rodent remarked, "My friend, there isn't a regret that can't be turned into a benefit." He grinned at the man wearing his helmet and said, "And your skills could save the lives of our students if you took the time to teach them." "What do you say?" he asked. Someone knocked on the door and said, "I say." Nezu yelled softly, "Come in." "Sir, I was wondering if you've seen my dad," Izuku said as the door opened and he entered. The child froze as he saw his father there in the room and said, I'm sorry, I'll come back later." Hisashi nodded to Nezu and turned to face the door after his father yelled for him to halt. "Hold on, kiddo, we were just finishing up," he replied. "I'll give you an answer by the end of the day." The rodent grinned and said, "Fair enough," as the two of them walked out of his office. As they left the principal's office, Hisashi turned to face his son. The child flushed and Dad said, "It's rare that you come looking for me during the day, son. Something happened in class one need to know about," he said. Izuku's mouth opened, but nothing came out. With a frustrated sigh, he said, "This is so awkward." His father answered, "Well, take your time," with a faint laugh in his voice. He was starting to trust his son since he was at last making an effort to open up to him. He would listen to anything his kid had to say, no matter how long it took. Izuku yelled out, "How did you know Mom was the right girl?" "Okay, nearly anything." With a heavy sigh, the man pulled off his helmet to gaze down at the child. "This is about Kyoka, ain't it?" he said. "Son, you're young, and thinking that you've already found the girl you wanna go steady with so early on isn't something to take lightly." "You mean you don't like her?" Izuku inquired nervously as he glanced at him. His father groaned in frustration, saying, "Not even remotely what I meant." Hisashi shook his head, and said, "I'm glad you found yourself a girlfriend, and a damned good one at that, Izuku, but the only thing that's gonna tell you if she's the right girl is time." He saw his son staring at him bewildered, so he palmed his face and said, "All right, I'll tell you how I felt about your mother." The boy grinned brightly and said, "We've known each other since high school, but neither of us managed to get a hero license. She was okay with that, but I wasn't, so I started doing vigilante work while working another job. She supported me, son. That's what made me want to be with her. And somehow, she wanted to be with me just as much." He grinned down at his son and ruffled his hair. Izuku said, "So, how am I supposed to know?" As the boy furrowed his forehead in perplexity. Hisashi exhaled and said, "Time." He said to the child, grasping him by the shoulder, "Kid, if you want to take this relationship seriously, then do it, but please don't slack in your studies." He cautioned him, "I realize you're far too stubborn to just turn your back on things, and only focus on becoming a hero, especially since you've adopted Eri, but I will give you a warning, don't take too much on if you're not sure you can handle it." Izuku appeared to be listening only partially. "So I should be serious about everything." Then, as he abruptly hurried ahead of his father, an idea suddenly came to him. "Hey, kid," exclaimed Hisashi. Izuku screamed back, "Thanks, old man." Hisashi shouted after the youngster, "I'm not that old, damn it." While a vein pulsed on his head. Spiderman. Later that night, the floor was covered in snacks and drinks that Kyoka, Momo, Toru, Mina, Ochako, and Suyu were sharing, and their laughing was bouncing off the walls, making her room extremely full. With her face still exposed due to her refusal to take off Izuku's power cuff, Toru smiled broadly from beneath a pink onesie with a bear motif. "When my parents saw me, they went nuts. I thought I was gonna start crying, too," she said. Kyoka smiled back at her and said, "You totally started crying when you first put that thing on," before crossing her arms and giving the girl a look. "And nearly flashed my boyfriend," she said. With a laugh, Ochako said, "And the teacher?" Suyu croaked cheerfully, "It's lucky that Mineta was transferred out. I'm sorry that he was kicked out of the hero course, but I've heard some pretty bad rumors about what he gets up to," she remarked, adding, "Pretty much the whole class." "So," Mina began, slyly glancing at Kyoka, "what's it like dating Midoriya?" As she leaned in, the girl beaming at the opportunity to learn about the first romance in their class. While the other girls giggled around her, Kyoka sat on her bed and blushed bright red. "Well," she said, taking the ends of her long lobes and tapping them together, "we haven't really had the time to actually date, you know. I mean, we just got together recently, plus he's got Eri and we've both got our schoolwork," she muttered. "Being a new couple I can believe," Toru butted in, "but both of you take care of Eri, and you do your homework together most evenings." She raised her eyebrows with a wiggle. "Are you gonna sit there and tell me that nothing's happened between the two of you aside from that kiss during the battle trials?" The pink-skinned girl leaned toward her and said, "No kissing," with a slight purple flush on her cheeks. "No touching." Mina smiled at her as she noticed a more noticeable flush appear on the girl's cheeks. She let out an ecstatic yell, "Aha! I knew it, deets. I need deets." Now, we really shouldn't pressure her," Momo said, laughing at the girl's antics. "But I have to wonder. Just how long have you, well, liked him, I suppose?" Momo grinned at the girl, who returned her smile with gratitude. "For a while, I guess," Kyoka shrugged. "It's kind of hard not to like a guy that'd risk his life to save a little girl," the girl remarked, putting down her jacks and leaning back on the bed. "Even when he's bleeding out," Momo nodded sympathetically, and the other girls went pale. "I knew you said that he'd been shot," the round-faced girl replied, "but I didn't think it was that bad." Ochako scowled a little at that. Recalling that bizarre, awful wet day when their paths had met, she nodded. She said in a serious tone, "Yeah, it was really bad," but a second later she grinned and said, "Weird, huh? Falling for a guy that was covered in his own blood when we met." Without humor. When Mina and Toru turned to face her, Tsuyu replied, "If you don't mind me asking, Hiro, where did he get the scars I've heard about? How do you know about them?" Kyoka said, looking at her bewildered, as she couldn't recall ever discussing them with anyone. "I overheard Kirishima and Sato mention that he was covered in some pretty nasty burns," Tsuyu said, lifting her shoulder. "You can thank Bakugo for that," Kyoka said sneeringly, nodding and gaining an angry expression. "He's Izuku's childhood bully." Toru scowled and shook her head, shaking. "Yeah," she said, "we heard as much over the speakers the other day when they were fighting." Did he really tell him to kill himself? She wondered, as the others glanced to Kyoka with worried expressions. "He doesn't bring it up, and I won't drag it out by asking about it," Kyoka said rapidly, shaking her head and letting out a long sigh. "I'd rather not open old wounds." "Good idea," Momo replied, "though I will say that allowing such a person to enroll in this school is beyond anything I thought UA would ever tolerate." She sighed as she considered the ashen blonde. "He's more of a villain than a hero at this point, and aside from Kirishima, there aren't that many in our class he's close to." As the others nodded, Mina turned back to Kyoka and said, "Yeah, but since we all saw Midori kick Bakugo's butt, we know that he's not untouchable." "So, you knew Midori for a long time before school started?" Mina asked, and Kyoka nodded. "Mind telling us what attracted you to him?" Mina asked. "Oh, you know, the usual." Kyoka had to laugh at that. She twirled one of her jacks around her finger and said, "Cute face, and a totally rockin' bod." Mina and Toru squealed, while Ochako, Tsuyu, and Momo blushed and giggled when they recalled the verdette's form-fitting costume. "And," the other girls said, quietly and eagerly approached. "Well, you all know this, but he's probably the sweetest guy I've personally ever met." Dreamily, Toru sighed, yeah, then. I bet kissing is like biting a hot cinnamon roll, ain't it, Kyo?" Mina asked slyly as she laughed. "He sorta gives off this warm vibe, doesn't he?" Kyoka's neon flush came back full force, giving her the reaction she was looking for. "Aha, I knew there was more kissing than during the battle trial. So we kissed a few times, big deal." Kyoka half yelled as her jacks went wild. "Kissing is good and all," Toru smiled at her. "But has there been anything else?" Kyoka covered her face as the words evoked another minor incident, and she wiggled her brow suggestively. As the dots came together, Toru and Mina exclaimed, "Oh my gosh, seriously, you guys already?" With her cheeks so flushed that she was nearly gushing out of her ears, Kyoka said, "Whoa, no. We have not gone that far, yet, no way." Mina said. She said yet, as she and the others burst out laughing. "You guys," cried Kyoka. The poor girl covered her face in embarrassment, and even Momo and Ochako were starting to giggle. "Now, both of you stop it," Momo said with a grin. "I'm sure that they're both being responsible. Plus their parents live on campus," Ochako said. "I know that if I had a nice boyfriend, and my parents were nearby, I wouldn't even be brave enough to hold his hand." When Kyoka saw that at least two of her friends were supporting her, she became a little more composed. "Tsuyu made 3. Plus they have Eri to think about, Hiro. Does she call you mom like she calls Izuku dad?" "No. At least, not yet." Kyoka grinned slightly, unsure of how the young girl perceived her, but it was clear to all that Eri was as devoted to her as she was to Izuku. Someone knocked on the window. Before the talk could continue, Toru saw the hand vanishing beneath the windowsill and stared in bewilderment, saying, huh. But we're on the 3rd floor. When Mina made the same link, Kyoka yelled as she predicted who it may be. Now, who do we know that can climb straight up a wall, and would be knocking on a certain someone's window? She said, laughing as the perplet sprang from her bed and ran for the window. Oh, this is totally like a scene straight out of Romeo and Juliet. Mina, I don't think that's a good reference considering how it ended, Hiro, Tsuyu said, croaking as Kyoka pushed open the window and a familiar head of green appeared. Hey, Midoriya. Sorry, I didn't know you had, Izuku said, his eyes almost popping out of his head. Momo said, oh, don't mind us, and rose to lead the other females out of the room. We were just leaving, weren't we girls? She said. During the loud complaints of Mina and Toru, Tsuyu and Ochako assisted in escorting the 2 girls who were interested in romance outside. As the door shut behind them, Kyoka waved and giggled. Please tell me you weren't hoping to catch us in our panties. She then glared at her lover. As Izuku had intended, he was already freaking out, saying, oh, of course not. I'd never do something like that, you know, MMPH. She managed to hush him by leaning over and kissing him directly on the lips. Fortunately, whenever Izuku's quirk went awry, it tended to make his wall-crawling ability stronger. He almost lost his grip on the wall, and gave his body a little electricity. Just as a tiny spark sparked between them, Kyoka leaned back and giggled. She gave him a smile and moved aside to let him in, saying, that never gets old. As he cautiously crept through her window, admiring all the instruments in the room, she remarked, oh, what, you knew I liked to play. But this isn't like you. As the girl sat on the edge of the bed and crossed her arms and legs, he accused her, no, it's not that, you're teasing me again, aren't you? She crossed her arms, exposing her breasts and exposing nearly all of her legs, a motion that made him blush even more. Evidence that she was undoubtedly curvaceous. Maybe, she grinned at him, but this is the first time you've come to my room here in the dorms. She laughs a little and says, usually you're too afraid of Aizawa catching you. With an embarrassingly bright blush, Izuku rubbed the back of his head and said, well, I wanted to talk to you. Now sitting upright on the bed with her palms resting on the mattress, Kyoka was even more intrigued. About what? She questioned, a terrible notion running through her head, is this a breakup kinda talk? At her query, the boy turned as pale as a sheet. Izuku screamed, what, no, and then put his hands over his lips. He became silent and said, I mean, this is just the opposite. Heaven help them if Iida caught them. With relief, Kyoka released a breath she had been suppressing since she posed the question and gestured for him to take a seat beside her. She smiled at his careful approach. Their parents had always been close by, and they had both had Eri sitting next to them while they sat on the couch in his house on multiple occasions. Right now, together, they were by themselves in her chamber, with absolutely no parental monitoring. Feeling the heat of his body next her, she fidgeted uneasily. Okay, so, what is it you want to talk about? She questioned, as the boy's leg began to jump uneasily. She looked down at her lap and flushed, saying, I mean, it hasn't really been that long since we got together, but I think things have been really great. At last, Izuku grinned and said, yeah, they have. He nodded and said, that's what I wanted to talk about. He took something out of his pocket. Kyoka's gaze expanded. Holy shit, the 2 teenagers have one thing in common. Their minds totally shut down when they were utterly agitated or unable to speak. Her mind went completely crazy when Izuku took out the small velvet ring box. She began to see pictures of herself in one of those flashy white dresses, a house with a white picket fence, and wedding bells ringing in her ears, all while her heart began to beat like a fast drum solo. Izuku continued, jolting her out of her adolescent romance-induced days. I had a talk with my dad earlier today, she said. He paused, then opened the package with trembling hands, saying, he thinks we might be moving too fast, but Her heart skipped a beat. It contained a plain silver ring set with tiny diamonds arranged in a note-like arrangement. To her astonishment and dismay, however, it turned out to be a promise ring rather than an engagement ring. Nevertheless, when he removed the ring from the cushion, she smiled. He took her right hand, which she extended, and carefully placed the ring on her ring finger. As he raised his eyes to meet hers and clasped her hand, Izuku admitted, I'm not really sure I know what love is. He shook his head and said, "But I do know that I want to be with you for however long this, whatever it is, can last." He gave the girl a shaky smile as he concluded. Kyoka's left hand flew up to cover her trembling lips as she had to bite her lip to prevent herself from choking. She pounced at him, her arms swinging around his neck as her lips smashed against his with full force. He grunted in surprise as his back hit the mattress. You sweet, sappy, jackass," she said. He tried to return her attack with as much passion as she was starting to display as she nibbled and manipulated his lips with hers, but he was still surprised and his arms were still around her as their lips molded together, the heavy breath from her nose irritating him. His hands moved in soft circles as he caressed her back, attempting to commit every contour to memory. She also didn't let her hands rest. She ran them up his neck and into his hair, her nails grazing his scalp in a pleasing way, and then she followed the same route to his chest. His abs. She then startled him by reaching under his shirt and feeling up his muscles while groaning into his lips. Two could play that game, though, with one hand remaining on her back and the other dipping lower and lightly squeezing her butt. She groaned as she pushed his shirt up near his shoulders and pressed herself firmly against him. As she pushed the shirt up, she briefly stopped kissing him. As she removed the garment from him and threw it away, he reflexively raised his arms. Her heart nearly stopped as her gaze swept over his flesh. She was reminded once more of how difficult Izuku's life had been. The lad turned his head away from her in embarrassment as he became pale for a moment after realizing why she was staring at him. Knowing that he was just as self-conscious about his scars as she was about her physique made Kyoka despise herself at that precise moment. So she did the only thing she could think of. She reached down, dropped her top on the floor next to his, and pulled it over her head. She couldn't comprehend the way his eyes seemed to wander over her body as he turned his head back and gazed at her, giving her chills. Embarrassment was evident on her face as she folded her arms about herself. She said in a shaky voice, see, could you not stare so much?" Then, rather of waiting for him to answer, she moved in and wrapped her arms around his chest, kissing a scarred area on his left pectoral. He let out a strained hiss of breath. Kyoka loved the way his rough hands moved across her bare back as his arms coiled back around her. She laughed when she was rolled into the mattress and he was now hanging over her. He caressed her cheek with his outstretched hand. She leaned into his touch as he ran his fingertips over her jaw. He took her in his arms and gave her a kiss. Light, feathery kisses poured down his face as she cupped it between her palms. "Izuku," she inhaled on his face while drawing him back to her lips with her fingers tangled in his hair. "We shouldn't be doing this," he said in a raspy voice, his body hovering only a few inches over hers. For a brief period, his comments appeared to sober her from the high brought on by passion. She noticed that the straps of her bra were down her shoulders, nearly exposing her breasts, and that her shorts were dragged halfway down her hips. It was the same with Izuku. She smiled a little when she saw the generally well-behaved youngster looking so unkempt. She was the one who had led him to this point, and it made her feel just as gorgeous as any other curvy-bodied girl she had ever seen. In order to loop her hands behind his head and draw him in, she untangled her fingers from his hair. "But," she said, putting a hand down to stroke his cheek, "I like kissing you," whispering as his lips lingered a few inches from hers. "Now, come here." He went right away, and they started kissing passionately while rubbing their lips together. After that, Murphy's Law and everything. Just outside her door, there was a raucous disturbance coming from the hallways. "Iida, no," Momo's voice cried out nervously. "Stop, it's not like they're doing anything," Toru's voice added. "They're doing homework," Mina cried in desperation, "I promise." "Definitely not. The school's rules have been clearly violated here," Iida's voice screamed out in anger. Over the commotion, Ochako's voice could be heard. "I'm positive that breaking the rules by entering a woman's chamber in this manner is another transgression." Her country accent sounded like a bell as she yelled. As Iida, wearing his pajamas, nightcap and all, was being poorly restrained by Mina, Toru, Momo, Tsuyu, and Ochako, the door to Kyoka's room smashed open. Somewhere during the altercation, Ochako had gotten hold of the speedster and activated her quirk, which caused Iida to float while the girls tried to restrain him. Naturally, their eyes immediately went to the bed where the two teenagers were entangled with one another. Izuku knelt over the half-naked Kyoka, whose face was as red as a tomato, and first he knelt over his scarred back. "Oh my." When Momo saw the two of them, she flushed. She remarked, her eyes as big as saucers, so they were doing something. Toru was sitting on Ida's back, either forcing his face down toward the carpet or covering his eyes to prevent him from seeing anything inappropriate. Sorry to interrupt. Quote. Yeah, sorry, Suyu croaked as Kyoka sat up and covered herself with her pillow before Ida noticed anything inappropriate. With a flushed face, Ochako muttered, "Ditto for me," attempting to turn away while holding Ida motionless. "Oh, this is so hot," Mina said, her eyes full of hearts. "But, you might want to run for it, Midori," she said, sitting on Ida's back with the majority of her weight supporting him. "Tenya is furious at the moment." Quote. Ida's head suddenly rose from where he was restrained, and his eyes glowed manically white. "You degenerates." Quote. A voice outside the room remarked, "Yo, Iida, do you need any assistance in there?" Quote. "Yes," Iida said, turning his head slightly. "It would be really helpful to me." Suddenly, his body became slack and his eyes turned completely white. "Iida, go to sleep and stay that way until your alarm goes off," Shinso's voice shouted from the hallway. "And forget why you were upset with Jiro and Midoriya." Ida's head fell quickly, and as he snored, a massive snot bubble began to rise in and out of his nose. With a sigh of relief, Toru stepped off the dozing teenager and said, "Thanks so much, Shinso." She yelled at the teenager. "Good night," Shinso replied, his voice fading, "just tell the lovebirds that they owe me one." Suyu took it upon herself to usher the two of them out, saying, "Sorry we couldn't stop him. Hiro, have fun, you two." Momo and Ochako quickly moved the prone teenager out of the room, and Mina and Toru gave them a few curious looks. She then used her tongue to shut the door. "Thanks, huh?" With his face as red as Kyoka's, Izuku mumbled. "Oh, gosh," Kyoka groaned, laughed as she hid her face in the pillow she was holding. "This will never stop." Quote. Izuku jumped out of bed and grabbed his clothing, saying, "I should probably." Kyoka's jack suddenly appeared and encircled his neck. "Go." Quote. "Oh, I didn't say we were done," Kyoka said with a smile to her partner. "Come on over here," she said, drawing him back in. When Kyoka eventually dragged herself out of her blissful, romantically induced slumber the following morning, she checked her right hand first and exhaled a sigh of relief at seeing the promise ring tucked away on her finger. It wasn't a dream. With a dreamy sigh, she pressed her pillow to her bosom, feeling giddy as if she were experiencing the ultimate sugar rush. "Kyoka," Mina continued, "sorry to wake you, sweetie, but Mr. Aizawa popped in and said that you've got some new equipment waiting for you down in the support course room." A gentle knock on her door startled her out of her reverie. "New gear," Kyoka remarked, becoming alert, "but I never ordered any." "Yeah, everyone else thought it was weird," Mina said, sticking her head in the door and glancing at the girl who was still wearing her bed clothes, except for her regular deep dope tank top, which was still on the floor. "Whoa, Midori really did a number on," she said, shaking her head, "never mind." She coughed sharply and hurried into the room, saying, "Come on, we need to get you presentable before Ida comes barging in here again." As Mina grabbed her and dragged her out of bed, the girl tilted her head and asked, "Presentable?" "Mina, what are?" The lavender flush on Kyoka's cheeks deepened as Mina turned around and pointed to her neck. "Sweetie, the entire left side of your neck is covered in hickeys," she said, adding, "and I doubt you want Iida, or, God forbid, a teacher seeing those." Mina's lavender blush was unusual for her. "Oh, God, my parents are gonna kill me." Kyoka groaned as Mina pulled her into her bathroom and sat her down in front of the mirror, providing her with a clear view of the extent of the harm Izuku had caused to her. Her hand nearly flew up to her neck, and she felt her heart sink as she touched the swollen skin around her left side. Mina had not been lying when she claimed that her neck was covered. It appeared to be a massive bruise. "Oh, God. Now, this is fixable," Mina reassured her, her voice taking on a lively tone once more. With a makeup kit in hand, she returned to the room after a brief absence, saying, "I've got everything you need right here, so no one will be the wiser except you and Midori." Kyoka let out a moan. She detested cosmetics. After a few minutes, Kyoka had a passion for makeup. As Mina applied the toner to her skin, she was humming a melody. Her efforts had virtually eliminated the redness. To cover up the swelling from last night's kisses, she then dabbed Kyoka's lips with a light violet lipstick. "There," the girl with the pink skin said with a smile, allowing Kyoka to admire her creation. "You look absolutely beautiful, Kyoka." Her cheeks flushed. "You really think so?" she said incredulously. As both of them recalled the near catastrophe that had occurred the previous evening, Mina simply smiled at her in the mirror and gave her a back embrace. I sure do, and all of us girls are really happy for you, ya know. Mina said, laughing. And since it's Midoriya, you probably got the best guy in class. When Mina pushed her cheek against Kyoka's, Kyoka laughed and said, seriously. Even though she was silently agreeing with the girl. He's cute, he's smart, and he's got a quirk that's bound to take him far in the hero business, Mina said with a smile and a nod, her black eyes sparkling joyfully. If everything goes as I hope, you two are going to have a great life. You really think we're a good match? Kyoka questioned, recalling the night it all started on their way to UA, as Mina had clearly not yet noticed the ring on her finger and had covered it carefully with her left hand, to protect Eri. The first time she had considered joining Izuku and Eri's small family was at that very moment. Mina laughed and rubbed her cheeks with her again, saying, oh, totally, and personally, I'm super jealous. I mean come on, Midori's a catch that you'd be crazy to throw back. Plus Eri's the sweetest little angel I've ever met. Mina laughed and gave the girl a sly smile in the mirror. I can honestly say that if you two break up, then Mama Pink's swoopin' in to snatch both of them up. That's never gonna happen. Kyoka smiled back at her, and she laughed, I'm not planning on giving him up. Mina released her from her arms and said, now, come on, and get dressed. She laughed again and kissed her on the cheek. That's what I like to hear. Recalling that Iida had interrupted them the previous evening, Kyoka let her pull her up. With little to no expectation that it would happen, she questioned, how long will Iida not remember walking in on us? The girl worried somewhat, but Mina gave her a comforting pat on the shoulder and said, he didn't seem any wiser about it this morning, and no one was dumb enough to say anything. Though Shinso did mention that he'd remember in a few days, but that'll give you guys time to prepare. Of course it wouldn't be permanent. Kyoka groaned, palming her face, while Mina merely laughed. Spiderman. The UA, the office of Toshinori All Might. As he served his guest tea, Toshinori began, thank you for coming on such short notice. I realize that this came out of nowhere since we haven't spoken in such a long time. He grabbed for his tea and took a grateful sip. Now then, Mirai Sasaki remarked, to what do I owe the pleasure of this meeting? The guy in front of him shook his head, saying, there's no need to explain yourself, All Might, adding, I was rather insistent the last time we met. You're the one with foresight, Night Eye, so why don't you tell me? Toshinori laughed. It has something to do with your successor, that much I am certain of, said the individual. I do have someone in mind to accept it, if you're willing to meet him. Mirai looked at Toshinori in surprise as he nodded. In truth, I thought that I'd already found the perfect successor, a quirkless boy with a kind heart and a brave soul. Even though he knew that utilizing his foresight to discern All Might's choice would only enrage his former mentor, as it did the last time he used it on him, Mirai remarked, you say that you thought you had found the right one, briefly turning to his quirk. Did something happen that made you change your mind? Toshinori took a deep breath and nodded his head slowly. Yes, something did happen, Mirai. I happened, he said, shocking his former sidekick. When I first met him, he poured his soul out to me, and asked if he could become a hero even though, at the time, he didn't possess a quirk. He shook his head, adding, and given my own past experiences, I sought to protect the boy, and told him that he couldn't become a hero without any sort of quirk to help him. Admittedly a cruel, but wise choice, he added, emphasizing his comprehension with a nod. Though it is uncommon for quirkless heroes to arise, when they do, the mortality rate is extremely high, he continued, focusing on what his former mentor had said. But you said that he didn't have a quirk at the time. He asked. Laughed, I'll get to that in a moment, he patiently replied. Anyway, after we parted ways, I turned to my future career as a teacher in order to find that successor you mention, and when the entrance exams came around, who should I see there but that same young man? He nodded his head in awe. I had never seen such a transformation before. In the time between our first meeting and the exam, that boy had not only improved himself to the point of near quirkless superhuman strength, but he had also created support items for himself that made him a shoo-in for the support course. He sat back and recalled the day Midoriya had taken the exams. His scores on the written part of the exams were among the highest in the school's history, he said, shaking his head. And when the practical exam came up, he sighed sadly. His support gear managed to help him damage some of the robots, and he absolutely bloodied his fists in his attempts, but the combat points he earned were minuscule, he said, then lost his smile. But he broke the record for rescue points, he said, his smile faded. But Nezu discovered his quirkless status, and vetoed his acceptance into the hero course because he believed the boy wouldn't survive. Mirai repeated her nod. Unfair, to be sure, considering that could be grounds for a geneticism charge. That's close to what I said in the end, Toshinori grumbled. I failed to find him after the exam, and I lost hope of ever seeing him again. He put his fingers together. Then I get a call from Naomasa. You remember him, about a case of abduction and extreme child abuse. Winced. The former sidekick whispered empathetically, I'm actually working on something similar at the moment. Those types of cases are never pleasant to deal with. The brunette replied, it's actually part of the reason I called you here. UA's hosting a child in protective custody, and I'd like for you to use your quirk on her if we have enough time. He clarified, it might shed a little light on who was holding her, Toshinori said as the detective nodded in agreement, but this little girl was saved by the same boy I just told you about. He was shot in the process, but all the time that he was bleeding out the only thing he thought of was getting that poor little thing to safety. He exhaled. Luckily enough, he ran into some friends that were able to take the girl to the police and get him medical attention, and that's where things took a strange turn. The doctor that treated him used the boy as an experiment, I suppose. Toshinori's shape started to smoke as he gained with rage. He was injected with a mixture of what I'm told was devil's breath and Black Widow venom, either one of which should have killed the boy, but they didn't. Instead he spent a week in the hospital in a coma before coming out of it with arachnid-like powers. If I were to try to sum them up as separate quirks, the boy would have 6 quirks in total. Mirai stared at him with disbelief. Superhuman strength, enhanced speed, an extremely powerful healing factor, the ability to crawl or walk on any surface without losing his balance, a sort of sixth sense that lets him detect danger, near or far, and he has a form of bioelectricity that he can discharge at will in small bursts, or one massive blast that not only fries tech, but messes with the nervous system that controls a person's quirk, and can easily damage his surroundings when he unleashes enough of it. Looking down at his cup, Mirai mused, it's amazing that things turned out so well for him. Is it this arachnid-themed hero the news was barking about a few months ago? The one that took on Kendo Rappa? He asked. Toshinori agreed, that's the boy, and asked, why? After giving his mentor a scowl, Mirai said, I want to meet him. Spiderman. In the interim, Shinso sighed as the two of them made their way down the corridors to the support course room. Seriously, Midoriya, you caused one hell of a commotion last night, Shinso said. Iida woke up almost half the entire block with all that yelling he was doing in the halls while the girls were trying to keep him away from Jiro's room. With a shy pat on the nape of his neck, Izuku said, sorry, but I'm not sorry. He grinned as he poked him lightly, like a hotel or something. Shinso snorted with a slight smile on his face, saying, hey, I'm not judging you, but next time, take the romance somewhere else. Izuku's face was blazing with shame. We didn't do anything like that. The agitated teenager said, we. Shinso smiled and pointed to his neck, saying, I'm not the one with a huge hickey on my neck, now, am I? The brainwashing kid simply laughed at him. He said, raising his palm to the left side of his neck, his face flushed from neon to nuclear red. It was a lot worse when I got home. He whispered, somewhat embarrassed, if I didn't have a healing element in my quirk, then I'd probably look a lot worse. As the boy behind him laughed, Shinso mumbled, damn, didn't think the girl had it in her. Anyway, what were you going to do in the support room? He smiled. Izuku's expression instantly brightened, and he pulled one of his now famous notebooks from somewhere Shinso didn't want to know. Oh, May's got some upgrades she wants me to test out for my mask. There were no pockets in his costume, really. I also wanted to pitch a new costume design at her. Shinso smiled and whistled, hey, not bad, as he glanced at the page he had opened the book to. But isn't the suit you have right now made by Mike Tower's personal support gear company? He said. Yeah, and it also follows the color scheme that Dad uses for his costume, too, so I really like it, Izuku said with a hint of pride, patting the area on his chest where the arachnid insignia was. But I'd like something that makes me look a little more friendly while doing hero work in the daytime, and keep this one for night work. After giving him a quick glance, Shinso smiled back and said, Eri thought it looked scary, right? The head of the verdette fell. Yeah, you really do love that little girl, don't you? Shinso asked. laughing and giving his classmate a pat on the back. His companion remarked, "She's my world," with a bright smile. Well, her and Kyoka. They arrived to the support course room just as Kyoka emerged holding a tiny box. Speak of the devil, Shinso sighed as he stepped past Izuku, smiling when the girl saw them and blushed as her eyes fell on him. "I'll go ahead and ask Powerloader about my equipment and costume design, you two, take your time." He laughed as he entered the room, leaving the two teenagers alone. When Izuku saw the ring on her finger, he blushed brightly and said, why you're still wearing it." He berated himself for his lack of intellect. With her jacks joyfully fluttering around her head, Kyoka laughed and added, "Well, yeah, it's not like I'm gonna take it off anytime soon," her cheeks starting to flush a little. You getting some upgrades done?" she said. "Yeah, May's idea," he replied. "I also wanna have another costume made that won't scare Eri." "She's scared of your hero costume?" Kyoka inquired, blinking quickly. "This is the first I've heard of it," she said incredulously. Izuku sighed. She didn't actually say she was frightened by it, but she did say that the eyes on the costume were kind of scary. He replied with a slight grin on his face, "And since she's been through so much already, I thought I should have something else on hand when I'm around school since the costume Mr. Yagi had made for me is more suited to combat." When Kyoka turned and positioned her box against the wall near the support course door, she giggled, "I can see that. Do you have a design sketched out?" he asked, passing her his notebook. Kyoka gazed down at the black and white sketch and exclaimed, "Wow, I love the hooded look." She was beaming broadly as she attempted to visualize the costume on her boyfriend, saying, "The darkened spots are obviously going to be all black, but what about the white and gray areas?" Scowled Izuku. She used his notebook to slap him across the forehead, saying, "I was gonna go with the same colors of my first costume." Ouch. That color scheme works for that costume, green bean, but if you're gonna take a step away from the original, then why not go all out? Kyoka asked, laughing at the disgruntled expression on his face. She took a red pen out of her pocket and said, "See here." As he leaned over her shoulder to see what she was doing. "Red and black go really well together. Here in these lighter spots you can make it a crimson red," she said, adding color to the upper arm and breast. "And the darker areas can be ruby, wine red would look better with the black accents." As she worked, Izuku grinned and exclaimed, "Wow, you're really good at this," before noticing a pleasant smell and asking, "Is that cinnamon?" The girl's face flushed more than the suit she was creating at the mention of the aroma. She said, leaping away from him with her hair flying in every direction and her eyes wide. She moaned, hiding behind the book. "Damn it, Mina." Izuku was ready to inquire as to what was wrong when he saw that she had applied a light shade of purple lipstick and that, in contrast to himself, her complexion was free of the effects of the previous night's actions between them. He saw the girl in a new light the instant he observed her makeup and scent, as if there were a real radiance surrounding her. The teenager exhaled, "Wow, you look stupid," Kyoka questioned, supposing Mina had only been kind to her earlier when she had praised her appearance. She offered a little giggle, but Izuku corrected her immediately, saying, "Gorgeous, a total knockout." He took the book away from her face and said, besides, pulling at the neck of his costume where she had left her own marks, "Your way works a lot better than this thing." He smiled. "BTOOOM. Yeah, damn it Hatsume, sorry." The support course's doors sprang open, and Shinso emerged, appearing burned and utterly afraid. "Save me," he cried as he hurried past them, May following him with what appeared to be a spiked dog collar. "You still haven't tried my latest baby, yet," the Rosette exclaimed as she hurried after him. Powerloader emerged with a frustrated expression on his face and mumbled, "Oh, man, here we go again." He then turned to face Izuku and said, "Oh, hey Midoriya, here for that new upgrade." Both Kyoka and Izuku watched the drama play out with twitching mouths and suppressed laughter. "Well," he said, gesturing at the chase scene down the hall. "Didn't May put it together? Are you kidding? Sure, she comes up with the idea, and machines it here in the shop, but I'm the one that finalizes everything." Powerloader responded with a shake of his head, pointing to the ruins inside the chamber. "And makes sure they're safe, unlike her test subjects." Knowing that May was tenacious when she had an invention she was determined to test out, Kyoka smiled and remarked, "Yeah, no kidding," gesturing to their escaping classmate. "Is Shinso gonna be okay?" "He should be fine," said Powerloader. Now, Midoriya, about that upgrade. He extended his hand to Izuku. This is a new chip you'll need to install into your gauntlets. Since you can turn invisible, Hatsume figured you'd need something that would act like a silencer for your web shooters. She calls it the Ghost Strike program. Before Kyoka gave the teacher his notebook, Izuku smiled and accepted the chips. Thank you, sir, and please, thank Mei for me, too. I'd like to have another costume made, too. Is that okay? He asked. Izuku gave his explanation, saying, well, I can understand that, and it wouldn't hurt to have a spare costume. Powerloader asked, wondering what was wrong with the suit he was wearing, a new suit. He nodded, thinking for a moment, then said, all right, but I'd like to use a different material than what Might Towers used. Go ahead, Izuku said with a nod. With a smile on his face, Powerloader took the design and said, I'll use a combination of military-grade fabric and adamantium threads. He added, it'll be a little heavier than the usual, but way lighter than your other costume from Might Towers since it uses plates instead of any kind of mesh or threading. And it will be completely bullet and knife-proof. Elements, though, I'm not so sure. Heat will definitely be a problem, and maybe, Powerloader started to sound like Izuku on one of his muttering tirades before leaving the two alone once more. Kyoka chuckled and said, I think you might be rubbing off on him. After they laughed together, Izuku saw Toshinori come down the hall. Ah, there you are, young Midoriya, the blonde man said, smiling as he met the two. He briefly looked at Kyoka and asked, young Jiro, do you mind if I borrow him for a bit? The girl nodded. I'll see you at your place when you get done, Kyoka said with a grin and a gentle tap on her boyfriend's shoulder. Go on, she said, picking up her box and moving away from him. She nodded to the skeletal man as she went by him and said, try not to keep him too long, okay? In a cheerful voice. Izuku grinned after her, his gaze involuntarily straying to her hips, and Toshinori laughed at her, saying, you have my word, my dear. I hope I didn't interrupt you, my boy. He laughed, noting the direction the boy's eyes appeared to be going. Nah, we were just finishing up with the support course, answered the kid. What did you need, All Might? I feel that there's no need to ask, Toshinori remarked, nodding and grinning slightly. But are you familiar with Sir Night-Eye? He asked. Ahem, is there something I can do for him? Izuku asked, coughing lightly to conceal his embarrassment. He was your second sidekick, and your first official one when you came back to Japan after your time in America after David Shield, Izuku said excitedly, before he was able to stop himself before he could go on another of his tirades. I'm afraid that it's a little unpleasant, Toshinori scowled, in response to the boy's perplexity. It concerns Eri, and the people that held her for so long. Izuku's hands tightened uncontrollably at the sound of that, creating tiny electrical arcs across his knuckles. Does he know where they are? Toshinori was taken aback by the boy's abrupt shift in attitude. Young Midoriya, he said firmly as he reached out and put a soothing hand on his shoulder. I have absolutely no right to tell you not to be angry with these men, he said apologetically. However, if you have it in your head to learn about, and pursue them, then our conversation will end here. He went on, his tone becoming serious. I will not allow you to put your future at risk for the sake of seeking vengeance when you don't even have a hero license, yet. You're right, Izuku exhaled in frustration, nodding and taking a deep breath. As much as I want to hunt them down, I can't risk them finding Eri if I fail. The blonde let out a sigh of relief and said, that's better. Toshinori nodded and said, now, let's go talk to Night-Eye, turning to lead the youngster down the corridor. Young Midoriya, there's a lot that I need to explain as well, he said. Unknown place. Returning to the depths of the doctor's laboratory, Shigaraki grinned under his father's palm. The attack day was getting closer. Even if they were defeated, they would all be nothing more than his pawns because he had amassed a force big enough to defeat even All Might. The things he was now seeing were the true danger. Before turning to face the young man with a warm grin, the doctor was in the process of injecting number 7 with some kind of chemical into his arm. As he completed his creation, the man grinned and said, Tamura, good to see you again, my boy. I take it the preparations are all in order? He asked. Shigaraki rasped out, we're ready, as the young man nodded. Now we just need to decide when to attack. The doctor smiled endlessly at him and said, and that, my dear boy, is precisely what I have. He motioned for the younger man to follow him and said, the files you managed to get for me were of great use. All Might is scheduled to teach a class off campus in 2 days' time. This is going to be so exciting. I can't wait to rub people's faces when their favorite hero is laying dead in the mud. Shigaraki stated with a hint of eagerness. That would be Monday, then. With a laugh deep in his throat, the doctor said, but let's not forget that I will need all of the samples I can get. He reminded the young man, and there is that one child in particular that I'm greatly interested in. He took a picture out of his lab coat pocket and showed it to the boy, saying, I think I've told you about her, haven't I? As he scowled and tugged at his mustache. You probably did, but I really don't care, Shigaraki remarked dismissively, nodding as he glanced down at the picture. I just want to kill All Might. Ah, yes, I know, he replied, and believe you me, my boy, even if we do not kill All Might, this time, the data I gather from the battle will give me all the information that I need to create my true masterpiece. Those 3 spiders aren't, Shigaraki said, pointing to the 2 pods that held the massive arachnoids. The doctor turned to the boy and said, even my own quirk wasn't perfect, you see, but that is what I strive for, the absolute perfection of a quirk. Far from it, he said, leading the boy deeper into his lab while passing various pods that contained other Nomu. My creations all have their flaws, my boy, but when the process is complete, my creation will have not a single, solitary weakness or flaw when it is born. As they passed a 4-armed apparatus that appeared to be connected to a spinal cord, Shigaraki nodded slowly. The mechanical motions of the tentacle-like arms scared him a little, so he asked, and the master's been helping you do that? He has, said the doctor, and it's for that very reason that he has my complete loyalty. He went on, because now, while my body has aged, my quirk research has allowed me to evolve my quirk from life force to immortality. He smiled, and I know more about quirks than any other human being on this planet, because I dare to go beyond what normal people are willing to do. He turned to the boy and asked, do you see where I'm going with this, Tamura? And it is for that reason that I absolutely must have this child, he said with a determination that nearly alarmed the withered teen. Kurono and Chisaki claim that she has the ability to rewind an organism to non-existence if she doesn't control her power properly. That means she could, theoretically, restore a being to their prime. You think you can use her to restore Master? Shigaraki smiled behind his father's palm as the teenager's beady red eyes widened. Precisely, my boy, he laughed, and I do not care how much of her I have to dissect, I will have her power and I will restore our master back to his full strength. Then we should find this little brat while we're out having fun, shouldn't we? Shigaraki said with a smile under the hand on his face. Yes, my dear boy, the father said with a sly smile, yes, we should. Spiderman, the UA, the office of Toshinori All Might. It would be a huge understatement to say that Izuku was anxious right now. One of All Might's 2 ex-sidekicks was going to meet him. However, Toshinori should have been frightened based on his actions. Izuku was more anxious than he typically would have been when he saw the man, whether in his muscular or shrunken form, worried about meeting one of his old pals of all things. The man, who was standing outside one of the teacher's lounges, inhaled deeply before turning to face the young man. Put your mask on, he said, getting a confused look from Izuku. His quirk requires direct eye contact, and I don't want him using it on you. As Izuku put on the mask, he muttered, okay. Why not, though? Toshinori sighed and said, and he's just about as fond of me as you are yourself. Mirai can be a tad bit paranoid. As Izuku started to grasp his meaning, he said, oh, so he's. Toshinori scowled and added, even if he is a bit overprotective. He straightened, reached for the handle, and opened the door. A huge mega dork fanboy, he continued, then laughed. But he is a good man, and a fine hero. It was to discover that Night Eye had company. The boy with the blonde hair shouted enthusiastically, hey, I know you, you're that spider guy that the Daily Bugle has been writing about. Sir Night Eye nodded to Toshinori and said, thank you for bringing him to meet with me so quickly. He frowned as he looked at the boy's masked face and said, I see that you've warned him about my quirk. Mirio, what have I told you about reading that hero-hating nonsense? He asked in a drone. Aside from that horrible newspaper, I understand that he's been the talk among the first-year students. As he sat down on the couch across from the man, Toshinori nodded and said, can you blame me? And I see that you've brought your young protege, Mirio Tagata, wasn't it? That's me, sir, he said with an outstretched hand, acknowledging the boy's smile. Mirio Tagata, hero name, Lemillion, the hero that will save 1 million lives. Before he spoke, Toshinori shook the boy's hand and laughed, and Izuku did the same. As he sat down, the man thought, I can see why Night Eye likes him. He's much like myself after obtaining my quirk from Nana. Mr. Yagi said that you had information on my daughter, Izuku remarked calmly and levelly, grateful for the mask because his smile would have embarrassed All Might. His voice suddenly hardened, and who might have tortured her? Mirio, the blonde boy, looked frightened and said, tortured. In a hoarse croak. Izuku's speech seemed to be as peaceful as Mirai's face. That all depends on who this young lady might be, he added, reaching into his breast pocket to get them. Is this the little girl that's currently under your care? He asked, holding out what looked like a Polaroid picture, face down, toward the hero in training with a spider motif. When he shot the picture, Izuku was already braced for the worst, but when he flipped it over and saw the picture. Whoa there, young Midoriya. Toshinori leapt to his feet when he was almost struck by one of the tiny lightning bolts, and the glow from the spider insignia on his chest grew stronger as sparks of electricity burst all over his body. Easy. The blonde man calmed him, being cautious about sparks. While his mentor stayed composed and just relaxed back, Mirio and Night Eye had leaned back from the screen, with the younger blonde almost climbing over the back of the seat. Judging by your reaction, I assume that she truly is the little girl I've been investigating. He groaned, aware that things could get tricky at this point. He scowled at the emotional show as he sat back and intertwined his fingers together. Mr. Midoriya, I would like you to tell me everything about the day that you met this girl, from the moment you left your home up until the very moment she left your sight, he said, taking a paper and pen out of his jacket. After regaining control of himself, Izuku nodded and returned the picture to him. He went on to provide a thorough account of everything that had happened before he saw Eri that day, from his horrible state of mind to the time he pushed the trembling young girl into Bakugo's arms and told him to take her and flee. Sir Night Eye was actively noting everything the boy said during this time. Mirio was staring at the younger adolescent with a great deal of admiration and a newfound respect. After Izuku finished, Night Eye finally remarked, "You're a very brave young man, and I can see why my old friend is so willing to help you." "Thank you," Izuku replied. "But you haven't answered my question, yet." The tall man exhaled. "I suppose I haven't," he replied with a smile. "The picture I showed you is from exactly 1 year ago, taken just before she made a run for it and met you. The figure you saw with her was one of her caretakers, I suppose you could call them, but really they're just her guard dogs." He glanced at the child's laced hands. "I don't know why anyone would want this girl, other than the fact that she must possess a highly dangerous quirk, and these men want to make use of it in some way. First of all, you're still not telling me everything there is to it." Izuku scowled at that, his glowing mask lens narrowing at the man. "Yes, Eri has an extremely dangerous quirk, one that I've actively tried to help her with, and safely restrained for the time being until her body is strong enough to handle the backlash, but these men." He pointed to the picture. "What could they?" he said, his voice hardening into an almost bestial growl that even Toshinori was taken aback. "He has a point," Toshinori remarked sharply, defending the youngster. "What is it that you're not telling us, Mirai?" Toshinori asked his former sidekick. Night Eye glanced between them, then at Mirio, who nodded. "I'd like to know, too, sir," the young man said, his face showing concern. He then turned to face the younger hero and the older blonde. "These guys that were holding onto this girl, they're all that remains of the Yakuza." Toshinori looked shocked, and more sparks appeared over Izuku's body. "Sir Night Eye's been trying to link them to the illegal sales of trigger that's been growing in the last 3 years. And I have," Mirai replied with a sigh. "I simply don't have enough hard proof to lock them away for good. They have so many branches that they move their product through that it's legally impossible to pin them unless I catch one of them in the act," he said, and then turned to his former teacher. "However, these men weren't always this brutal or organized. They once had a code of honor, as all Yakuza did. However, in recent years, the new head of this clan, the Shihasaikai, has been selling something new, a bullet that erases quirks." Izuku exclaimed, "What?" as Toshinori stood up, the latter coughing up a lot of blood. As the coughing spasm passed, Mirio offered the man a tissue to clean himself. However, he gave the man a startled and irate look with his electric blue eyes, saying, "No wonder you wouldn't let me near this case. Even if the bullets I've seen have only been momentarily effective," Mirai added, "you're already limited in your abilities thanks to your old injuries, which, because of secrecy, passed directly over Mirio's head. I couldn't risk you being hit with one of these bullets," Toshinori said, No, no, you're right. I would have gone charging in guns blazing and not even thought of the consequences, but what does this have to do with Eri? While raising one hand and pinching his forehead with the other, Izuku's analytical mind was a curse for the first time in his life because he had spent so much time with Eri and had tried to help her control her quirk so that she wouldn't be afraid of it anymore. He knew exactly how the sweet little girl's quirk could be related to a quirk-erasing bullet. The bullets, he muttered, his voice shaking, they're darts, aren't they? Mirai looked at him and nodded. And the substance inside them that erases a person's quirk, there's human cells mixed in with them, isn't there? Now, Mirio leapt from his seat and exclaimed, they wouldn't. His face was noticeably whiter, as though he would suddenly get ill. However, Izuku already had electricity charged in his gauntlets. He ground out, the green on his suit flashing blindingly bright. Eri has the ability to rewind living organisms to a certain point in time. If a person was skilled enough, they could use the quirk genes she has in, he said, suddenly getting to his feet. As the boy approached the door, Toshinori replied, young Midoriya. Kid, listen, Izuku stopped for a moment and looked back over his shoulder at the man. Please understand. I need to be with my daughter right now, he said thickly and heavily before turning to face Sir Night-Eye. If you want to use your quirk on her, then I'll let my mom know that I invited the three of you to dinner, though I'll understand if you have prior engagements. He turned back to the door and said, just promise me that you won't ask her any questions involving her captivity. The man nodded slowly behind him, but he couldn't see it. And if you use your quirk on her, promise me that you'll find these sons of bitches. The three men flinched as he opened and shut the door with such force that the wall around the frame shattered. I knew you said he was smart, but, Mirai remarked, turning to face Toshinori. Trying to sound upbeat, Toshinori nodded and said, he's near genius, Mirai, but he's like me and wears his heart on his sleeve. He looked at the floor and said, honestly, sometimes I think he's too pure for this world. He then raised his head and said, enough of this. Mirai, we have a dinner to prepare for. Young Tagata, why don't you come with me for a bit? I bet the ladies of the house would love a bouquet of flowers from such a nice young man. I'll provide some sake and wine. I'll bring some sort of dessert. Then, Mirai said, Izuku's offer, it is too promising a lead to pass up on. He stood up and looked at his student. I'll let your teachers know that you are to be excused for the rest of the day, Mirio. And Toshinori, I trust you'll speak to Mirio of your situation. For a brief moment, Toshinori gave the boy a slight smile before turning to face the door Izuku had left behind. Tonight, at dinner, Mirai gave him a stern look and said, no more lies. No more secrets. He addressed his former sidekick, saying, these boys are in the thick of things now. Perhaps both of them should understand what's coming. I owe it to both of them, especially young Midoriya. In the interim, Kyoka was watching Eri draw while she sat on the floor near the coffee table. That's really good, Squirt, she replied, gesturing to a figure that was primarily green. Is that your daddy? She asked. Eri smiled at her and said, before continuing to draw. This one's gonna be you, Kyoka, she corrected herself as she started over. Kyoka's lip began to tremble and she bit it. She began to fiddle with her jacks and said, hey, looking up at her with those lovely red eyes. You know, if you want to, you can, you know. Call me mom, or something. But only if you want to. She yelled in a tiny panic. The young girl sheepishly glanced down at her drawing. Is that really okay? Well, yeah, why wouldn't it be? Kyoka asked, glancing at her. Eri hurried around the table, grinned, and dropped her crayons. She immediately leapt on her, saying, I'll call you Mama, okay? With a laugh, Kyoka gave her a tight hug and said, you bet. I'll be the best mama ever. They were both startled as Izuku entered the house and the front door suddenly pulled open. When she saw the expression on his face when he removed his mask, Kyoka got up and held Eri in her arms. Hey, Greenie, how'd it go? She trailed off. Daddy's sad, was the first thing Eri said. Without even realizing they were there, Izuku leapt. Oh, hey, you too, he muttered, sounding unnatural. Eri fled straight for Kyoka after wriggling out of his embrace. Don't be sad, Daddy. She virtually pleaded, encircling him by his legs. If you're sad, then I'll be sad, and so will Mama. Since when does she call you Mama? Izuku asked his girlfriend, raising his eyebrows as he gulped back a giggle. Her cheeks were as red as apples when she crossed her arms and sighed. With a trace of shame, she demanded, "Since now, but so what?" Izuku laughed and shook his head as he held Eri in his arms and said, "She needs a strong mother figure in her life, and since we're dating, I figure that I'd be it." Then, to her amazement, he approached and gave her an embrace in which Eri might join. She massaged his back and said, "Hey, seriously, what's the matter with you? What did Mr. Yagi say that has you acting like someone just died?" Later, Izuku simply shook his head. He then moved to kiss her cheek and then Eri. "Right now, I just need both of you." After feeling him tremble for a second, Kyoka wrapped her arms over his chest and said, "Yeah, okay." Despite her concern for him, a tiny smile appeared on her face. "He needs me. Spiderman, you do realize that you are one of the very few indispensable people around me, do you not?" The master questioned, bending the doctor over a microscope. "Are you truly planning to go through with your plan to invade UA alongside Tamura Shigaraki?" He turned to the black screen that read sound only and said, "Not only would I have the opportunity to harvest some potentially worthwhile quirks for my research, and perhaps your use if you think they are useful, but it would give me a much-needed chance to see just what my firstborn has endeavored to become since our last meeting." The doctor laughed and said, "Yes, I do," lifting his eyes from the equipment. The master laughed. "To say that his subject is one of your children must mean he is quite special, is he not?" "Oh, he is," the doctor said with a warm smile. "The samples I took from him gave me these clones," pointing to the pods surrounding him, many of which contained horribly mutated arachnid-like creatures. "And my more advanced number 7 and no 8 arachnoid subjects, but they are far from perfect." He sighed. "This boy. I believe he could be the answer in creating my perfect child involving this truly unique quirk that I have created." He cackled. "Do you realize that, sir? I created his quirk." The master laughed as well. How many scientists can say that they have successfully created a viable quirk? And all it took was one quirkless individual among a veritable ocean of quirked individuals. He chuckled. "Just don't do anything to jeopardize yourself," informed the master. "As I said once before, you are irreplaceable in my court of friends." "Don't worry, my old friend," the doctor said with a smile, turning to a case with 4 long arms that resembled tentacles and were connected to a cybernetic spine. "I have ways of keeping myself safe while collecting my samples," he said. Spiderman. Dessert was followed by a tense dinner that night at the joint Midoriya Jiro residences. Shortly after the meal was over, Mirai utilized his quirk on Eri, and he discovered everything he needed to know. Given the boy's prior responses to Eri's abuse, Toshinori refused Izuku's request to ask him what he had witnessed. "I know that you want to do something about these people," the brunette said with a quiet voice, "but if I know you like I think I do, then you'll go off on your own, and possibly get yourself killed." He continued, "And that is not something you can afford right now. Eri needs you, and so does young Jiro, even though she won't openly admit it." "He's right," he replied, "these men are nothing like what you've faced up to this point. Even Rappa is considered low in their ranks." Mirai nodded as Kyoka and her family led Eri into the living room. As Mirio sat down next Night-Eye, Izuku scowled and looked over his shoulder at his small family. "It doesn't make it any easier." Hisashi gave his son a slight frown and nodded in agreement. "I won't say I don't know how you feel," he continued, adding, "because I know that I'd do anything if I knew you were being hurt." Izuku complained, says the man that was on the run for 11 years. "I'll tell you the story someday," Hisashi said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Anyway, I have to go on patrol. Stay out of trouble." He patted the boy's hair and was gone from the kitchen. "Now then," Toshinori said, putting his fingers together, "I think it's time you two knew something about myself, and All Might, and my quirk." He waited until Inko had cleared the table and begun cleaning the dishes before turning to face the 2 young men. And while Toshinori, All Might, talked of his quirk, his time as a hero, and the one that had laid him low and forced him to shorten his time as a hero, both Izuku and Mirio grew pale as they sat and listened to him. Toshinori looked at the 2 pale-faced boys and said, "But make no mistake, he was, without a doubt, a very real, very dangerous villain." He unbuttoned his shirt to show the hideous scar on his left side. "All for one was, and always will be a terrifying villain," he said. "Even now his name is spoken as if he were some sort of boogeyman. And for that reason he needs a successor," Night-Eye stated, looking at Mirio. "And I think you are the ideal candidate, Tagata," he remarked to the blonde. "I don't want it, I'm sorry," Night Eye blinked as both men turned to face the blonde lad. Toshinori smiled slightly, but his ex-partner appeared to have just spat in his face. I don't want All Might's quirk, Mirio said, turning to face the man. Don't get me wrong, I'm honored, he said quickly, but, well, I'm already well known for what my quirk allows me to do, but what happens when I suddenly start throwing punches that can knock down a whole city block? He asked. Plus, I'm Lemillion, the hero that will save a million lives. He nodded and grinned, saying, that's who I am. That's who I want to be. If I take your power, then I'm going to have to learn how to use your quirk and probably mine all over again, he said, laughing slightly at the withered hero. And then I won't be, well, I'll be me, but I won't be the same me I used to be, so. That, Toshinori grinned, was very well said. I'm actually quite impressed. The older blonde reached across the table and grabbed his shoulder, grinning broadly. And, honestly, after all that I've put you through, Izuku, I wanted to offer it to you first, but you. The boy looked at him bewildered, and Toshinori grinned and shook his head. No, I know that someday, both of you will be neck and neck for the #1 spot. With a glance at him, Night Eye asked, but what about your quirk? Relax, Mirai, I have plenty of time. He grinned, and who knows, I may find someone that is just as good as one of these boys. He grinned at Mirio and Izuku, but knowing that I can pass my quirk on to another. Izuku, I'm so sorry for how we met all those months ago. Izuku grinned. It's okay, the boy replied. If you had given me your quirk back then, I probably wouldn't be where I am right now. He then turned to face his family in the living room. And even if I could go back and accept it, I wouldn't, because I wouldn't change 1 minute of my life, no matter what kind of pain or hardships I had to endure. Izuku then turned back to the blonde man and grinned again. The child excused himself to go into the living room where his mother and the Jiros were playing with Eri, and Toshinori observed with a smile. Before he excused himself for the evening, Mirio went to talk to Izuku a little longer. The blonde man was grinning as broadly as he ever did when working on hero tasks when Mirai and Toshinori left for the evening. I'm sorry, All Might. I truly thought that Mirio would accept the quirk, said Mirai, who appeared to be rather depressed. Don't apologize, my old friend, Toshinori said, grinning at him. Tonight I witnessed something that would make any mentor proud, he said, turning to face the homes of Jiro and Midoriya. I saw 2 young men becoming amazing heroes in the future, and I don't even have your foresight. He grinned at the house. Lemillion, the hero that will save a million lives, he said, laughing as he saw the young blonde standing on the stage of the top heroes. And your friendly neighborhood Spiderman. Those 2 are going to rock this world to its core. That night, after everyone had gone, Kyoka helped Izuku put Eri to bed and saw that she was still acting strangely. Mika was left to help Inko clean up and talk to her since Kyotoku had already left for the evening. For the following several hours, Hisashi patrolled the campus. A drowsy Eri was laid down and nestled under her covers, giving the 2 teenagers plenty of alone time. With a smile on her face, Kyoka put her teddy bear, a gift from Kyoka before she came to UA, into her arms and cuddled it. You know what? She whispered to her partner. What is it? The boy said, turning on Eri's tiny nightlight while giving her a small smile. The girl grinned at him and then turned back to face the young child as she fell asleep. But now that I think about it, I don't think I'd change a damn thing about how all of this happened, except that I'd have wanted it to happen a little sooner. You could have told me this was going to happen a few months ago, and I would have told you to get your head examined, she said. Izuku sighed longingly as he nodded slowly, his gorgeous face marred by regret. Yeah, if only we'd met sooner. After scoffing softly, Kyoka grinned at him and grabbed the lad by the arm and dragged him out of the room. Come on, let's go over some of those new upgrades for your gadgets, she said. Okay, he muttered, bewildered. Mika had just entered the living room when she noticed her daughter pulling her boyfriend hastily into his room while wearing a knowing smile. The mother laughed to herself and sighed, rolling her eyes and shaking her head. Kyotoku isn't going to like this. In the interim, as the girl gently pushed him into his room, the youngster asked bewilderedly, Kyoka. I don't have any more designs to go over. The girl wasted no time in turning back and kicking the door shut. All right, mister, you are telling me what's going on. Right, now, she said, turning to face him with a look of exasperation on her face. Izuku said, I don't, and froze. With one of her jacks aimed dangerously near his nose, she yelled, Don't say that you don't know what I'm talking about. You haven't been yourself since you returned from that conversation you had with Mr. Yagi. Now tell me what happened. After a moment of frowning, he inhaled deeply. He turned his head away from her and murmured, It's not gonna be nice to hear. Izuku, she said, putting a gentle hand against his face to get him to look at her. The concern in her voice made him realize how upset she was over his actions. You barely ate anything at dinner. When you came home, you wouldn't put Eri down for hours. She returned her gaze to the door. And then that weirdo in the suit shows up with a third-year student and Mr. Yagi. Don't think I didn't see his eyes turn purple, green bean, because I know he did something to her, and if he's hurt her in any way. Whoa, Izuku informed her rapidly, that was Mirai Sasaki, I mean Sir Night-Eye. It's nothing like that. What did he want with Eri? Kyoka asked, staring at him in shock. A pro. He wanted to use his quirk so he could find out where she was being held and by whom, Izuku said, taking another breath. He pretty much already knew, but he wanted some real proof, she said, crossing her arms expectantly. Little beads of sweat started to appear on his skin, and his face started to turn pale. She cupped his face in her hands and whispered, Hey, as she ran her thumb over the cheek beneath his left eye. Take a breath, Izu, she said softly as he did as she had instructed. Good. Now. What are you trying not to tell me? She asked. What did they do? Her voice started to shake. What have they done to her? She asked. Before kissing the back of her knuckles, he reached up and clasped her hands in his. Sir Night-Eye thinks she was used in experiments. To make a quirk-erasing bullet, he said. Those scars on her arms, she said, gasping and stepping back a few paces. Her hands immediately went to her mouth as though she were about to vomit. Just as she was about to vomit, Izuku thought, oh my god. And grabbed down for the waste basket, holding it out in front of her. He led her slowly over to the bed and sat her down, tenderly massaging her back. He didn't know what else to say in the circumstance, but he felt foolish for asking, are you all right? As she put the basket down, Kyoka smiled shyly at him and added, that's not all, is it? With a faint laugh, I just found out my pseudo-daughter was used in human experimentation, so no, not really, she continued. He said, let me get you some water first, and she nodded slightly. He returned with a full paper cup of water after crossing the hall. To the girl's increasing horror, Izuku said, you were right, that wasn't everything, and it's not even the worst part of all of this, as she cleaned her mouth and rubbed her now dry throat. Mirio said that these guys are Yakuza. After glaring at him, Kyoka got up and said, basically professional villains that can get away with most anything. She threw the cup in the trash, then bit her thumbnail and turned to begin pacing the room. Okay, so these guys are actual pros at what they do, but if they need Eri, then why haven't they sent anyone after us besides that Rappa guy? Kyoka said. Izuku sighed, probably because of where we are, he said. Not only are we being kept at a school that has pro heroes as teachers, but we're protected by a really high-tech security system, and then there's the fact that All Might himself is stationed here as one of the teachers. Okay, I get it. Kyoka nodded in comprehension. They're probably too afraid of him to approach, she said, leaning against his desk. Then, what are we gonna do about this? She asked, her eyes beseeching. We, the three of us, we can't have a normal life until these guys are out of the picture. Izuku shrugged once more, complaining as if he wanted to take action. Night-Eye said for me to stay out of it. She sighed and crossed her arms over her chest, blushing slightly. And then there's you and me, she muttered. I know it's selfish to say something like this, but I wanna go out. On dates, dinner, movies, all the things normal couples do. She bit her lip in embarrassment. I get that, she said, looking down at the floor. What I mean is, she said. I know that, and we will. He said as he stood up and drew them closer. This is all gonna come to an end, Kyoka, and when it does, we'll be free to be perfectly normal, average teenagers training to be heroes, while raising an adorable, beautiful, wonderful little girl. He grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her against his chest. He then started massaging her back, something she was starting to really enjoy. Laughing at the ridiculousness of his remarks, Kyoka put her arms around his chest and said, God, you're so lucky I like you too much to just run away from all of this. What part about any of this is normal, Greenie? She said. Laughing, Izuku said, thank you for that. Seriously, though, she said as she looked up at him. What if, and I know that this is a pretty big if, but what if these guys get tired of waiting for us to fuck it up, and let Eri out of our sight, and just bust in here to take her? With a flash of electricity glinting over his skin, Izuku gazed at her and said, they'd have to go through me to do that. Kyoka tapped him on the nose and said, and that right there is what I'm afraid of. She blushed slightly and said, we don't know what these guys can do, but seeing you fight Rappa, I still have nightmares about that night. She shivered and asked, what if they've got someone worse? Then I'll have to fight harder, he informed her, his chest glowing a bright green. Even if they have someone worse than Rappa, there's no way that I'd back down, he said, grinning at her. The same goes for you, too, so don't think that I'd sit still and wait if you were in trouble. Well, I hope it doesn't come to that, Kyoka said, shaking her head. I hope Sir Night-Eye and the police can catch these guys, and put them away for the rest of their lives, she said, grinning slightly at him. He grinned at her and said, and that we can have our semi-normal lives back. She stood up on her toes and kissed him on the lips, saying, that too. Spiderman, you want me to give a lecture in the morning? Hisashi snarled into his phone. You're serious? That's right, Nezu replied from the other end of the line. Present Mike seems to be having problems with a cold, so his voice is not up to scratch for the time being. The Chimera rodent replied, I realize that this is a bit out of your comfort zone, but I do believe that you can give the students exactly what they need to hear about the topics I have in mind. Hisashi sighed, you know that this is going to make the parents want an explanation. He pointed out, I'm a mercenary. I've got no right in anyone's eyes to be teaching a class, let alone giving a lecture. You have more to offer these children than you realize, Mr. Midoriya, Nezu reassured him. I'll have a file sent over in the morning so that you can familiarize yourself with the two classes. Hisashi squawked, 2 classes. Before the line died and he glared at the phone, saying, she's eating little weasel. He then shoved the phone into his pocket. Spiderman. The following morning, lecture hall at UA. In order to obtain a better perspective, Denki, Midoriya, and Iida sat together in the high rows of the hall. So, any idea what this lecture's gonna be about? Denki said. Izuku merely shrugged, his mood soured because, although he had been compelled, using air quotes, to bring Eri along, Mina, Toru, and Ochako had taken his girlfriend and surrogate daughter away because they wanted to spend time with the young girl. Iida appeared delighted by the speech as his arms moved more robotically than normal. From what I understand, we'll be hearing about several subjects today before we begin our afternoon training with Mr. Aizawa. A moment later, Shinso arrived at the group. Morning, he said, yawning and appearing more worn out than normal. How's the new suit coming along, Midoriya? He asked. No news from Mr. Power Loader, but I assume it's going to take a little while. Izuku sighed, looking wistfully across the room where he saw Kyoka smiling at something one of the other girls said, with Eri sitting in her lap. Izuku had perked up a little. Separation anxiety getting to you already? Shinso smiled, following his gaze, and laughed while digging an elbow into his ribs. Just as the doors slammed open, Izuku gave him a fierce look. It's unbelievable that we must attend a lecture with these 1A jerks. Exclaimed a white-haired person with sharp teeth like Kirishima's. What the heck were our teachers thinking? An orange-haired girl with her hair styled in a side ponytail slapped him over the head. Just get over it, Tetsu. It's bad enough that I have to deal with Monoma's crap, but I am not listening to yours today. Behind her, a boy with blue eyes and blonde hair grinned broadly and remarked, arrogantly, well, it's not my fault that we're superior to Class 1A, which is surely full of delinquents. As the blondes group and their class poured in, Izuku turned around, feeling sour. You do know that 1A hasn't had a full class since they made Eraserhead their homeroom teacher, right? He remarked, receiving a disdainful glance from the blonde. He won't hesitate to expel anyone that doesn't meet his standards. He did that on our first day here. Dodging a swipe from the ginger, the blonde remarked, sneering at the child, and you think that makes all of you special, right? Just as I thought, 1A is nothing but. Shinso questioned the blonde, who appeared irritated at being interrupted. What's your name? The blonde scowled at him and remarked, rude as well it would seem. Shinso smiled back at him and continued, my name is. Shut the hell up and sit down. His eyes went blank before the blonde could finish, and as most of the students in the class were smiling broadly due to Shinso's quirk, he hurried to a seat beside one of his peers and sat down without uttering a single word. Good one, my man, Denki snickered, holding out a hand toward the weary-looking teenager. Shinso reached out and bumped fists with him. Before the girl approached them with a slight smile, Shinso remarked, "Sorry about that, but your friend was getting on my nerves." "You know it," he smiled at him. She gestured to the blonde who was now gazing back at them angrily and said, "Hey, no problem," laughing, "Matter of fact, feel free to shut him up anytime." This was actually one of his quieter days, she said. Aizawa and Vlad King entered via the doors next to the stage. "All right, maggots, find a seat and settle down," Vlad yelled as the remaining people fumbled for a seat. As you can see, both classes 1A and 1B are in attendance, and the reasoning behind this is to promote a good relation between future heroes. The rivalry between our two classes has, according to Principal Nezu, gone on long enough. If you all manage to graduate and become heroes, then someday you may find yourselves working together, and this school ground hatred will only make things difficult for you, Aizawa said, scowling deeply. Rivalry between individual students is one thing, he said, glancing absently at two students in particular. But the sheer hostility our classes seem to have for each other is the height of irrationality. Classes 1A and 1B will be working together in one of our many facilities on our large campus at the end of today's lecture, Vlad said, re-entering the room. The students began murmuring to one another at the prospect of working with the opposing class. While some people seemed unconcerned, others were more outspoken than others. The teen named Tetsu said, "Come on. We don't need." Aizawa turned to face the white-haired teen, whose eyes were glowing red and whose hair was standing up in an unsettling way. Tetsu sat down and hastily closed his mouth. As his quirk deactivated, Aizawa remarked, "Good. Now, let's introduce today's speaker," he said. Touching his left ear, Vlad said, "That's your cue." This time, the doors sprang open, and the sound of weighted boots sounded. When the well-known ex-mercenary in the purple suit took the stage, Izuku and Kyoka didn't require an introduction to the speaker. Izuku heard Kirishima whisper, "Holy crap, is that who I think it is?" And someone behind him growled. Shinso turned to face Kaminari and the green-haired youngster seated between them, who appeared to be in a panic. "Oh, man," Shinso exclaimed, gasping in shock as he glanced down at the stage. Although there were whispers that the man was on campus, no students had yet to see him. However, from his position beneath them, it was evident that the stories were accurate. The Prowler was their speaker. He walked up to the chalkboard and wrote, "Hisashi Midoriya," while many students turned to face him. He said, "Ex-mercenary, ex-vigilante, current head of security for UA Hero School and, for today, your speaker for this lecture." He slammed the chalk down and spun on his heel, his arms tucked behind his back, saying, "I'm here because Nezu asked me to be, not because I want to be. Goodbye, the end." Aizawa and Vlad scowled at the man over to the side. "Look around the room. Now, then," he said. "Who can tell me the purpose of being a hero?" "Bakugo," the man yelled as he pointed to one of the many hands that sprang into the air. The pale blonde snarled as if it were the most straightforward thing in the world as Katsuki got up to respond, "It's to defeat villains that the police can't handle." "Incorrect." The Prowler sharply shook his head. "What?" Bakugo sharply retorted. "The purpose, the idea behind the very concept of being a hero." Quote. Prowler glanced around the room after he had captured all of their focus, is to protect. Protect civilians that can't fight. Protect the police that can't handle the problem themselves. Even the villain is to be protected from themselves, the police, and the civilians that could easily overpower them after they have been subdued. Angry civilians could brutally maul the villain to the point of being beaten to death. He went back to the chalkboard and scribbled, "To protect," in big letters. Then he turned back to the students and said, "Defeating the villain is only a minuscule fraction of the mission that a hero is given upon taking up that title. A hero's duty, first and foremost, is to protect those that cannot protect themselves," he said, his glowing green eyes sweeping over the students. If a hero, in their debut, isn't completely aware of this, then they have absolutely no business being a hero at all. Continuing, he gestured to the entire class, saying, "Each of you has a power that is unique only to you. That power can be used for great good, but when using it, the responsibility of the damage that can possibly be done rests totally on you." He strode down the stage, his eyes falling on Kaminari of all people, and said, "A person with an electrical quirk could easily kill if the user isn't careful enough with the output of their powers." When Kaminari considered that, he shuddered. As Izuku held his shoulder, he thought, "Yeah, I know, man, I think about it every time I use my quirk." The same can be said for any elemental quirk, Prowler continued. Fire, water, ice, wind, electricity, all of these can be dangerous if used carelessly. He returned to the center of the stage. And for those of you with powerful quirks right now, those quirks will someday grow into something more powerful. Quirk evolution was written on the chalkboard after he strode back to it. According to Prowler, quirks, in theory, will continue to adapt and evolve as they are passed on from one generation to the next, adding, the theory of the quirk apocalypse is that a quirk, or quirks, will emerge that are so powerful that they cannot be contained, controlled, or neutralized if the need arose. He turned to face Bakugo and Todoroki, looking at them both. However, at this moment, your quirks are only just now beginning to grow. He said, looking at Bakugo, someday, the sweat from your entire body may be used as nitroglycerin, which would turn you into a walking, talking bomb. Katsuki did not look proud or excited as he usually did. One slip up, and you could level an entire block, or perhaps a city. He turned to Todoroki, and you, young man, could have the potential to be a true force of nature. He said as the heterochromic child clasped his hands tightly, fire and ice together can do great things, but used in the wrong way, they can cause utter destruction. Rapidly cooled air that's met with a sudden rise in heat can cause an explosion, or even a weather event like a tornado. When these powers of yours begin to grow in earnest, all of you will need to take care of how you control them, or they will run wild every time you use them. Surprisingly, his gaze fell on Ochako Uraraka, who shivered in fear. Even quirks that are perceived by others as weak can become something dangerous, he said. Gravitational powers in particular are, without a doubt, the most dangerous kind one can face. Sir. Ochako lifted her hand docilely. Prowler said, go ahead, Miss Uraraka. She looked down at her padded fingers and replied, well, sir, my quirk, well, it really isn't all that strong. I can make things float by taking away their weight, but other than that. Prowler then darkly chuckled and pointed to the teenager. And that right there is one of the first, and worst mistakes a potential hero can possibly make, he explained. Underestimating or overestimating the power of your quirks is a near fatal mistake. He continued, long ago, before my days as a mercenary, my quirk could barely produce a welding flame. It was unsuited for hero work. But, as my time as a vigilante soon taught me, my quirk grew in power. He raised his voice, now, my flames can burn hotter than lava, and I can breathe a stream of fire 30 feet long. Unfortunately, my body can barely handle that level of heat, so I don't often use it. I have to rely on my physical abilities and my tech to get the job done. Gravitational quirks are as rare as teleportation quirks, and they are never weak, he stated with a grin. You may only have the ability to remove the gravity of whatever you touch right now, Miss Uraraka, but that sort of power is what we in the business call gravitational upforce. This ability can be used via touch, however, in some cases, it can be spread out to affect a wide area. Should your quirk evolve to such a state, then you can use it to greater effect. But I advise caution, as this type of power can cause distortion in the Earth's gravitational force. With a newfound respect, Ochako gazed at the pads on her fingers and asked, I could, really be, that strong? I already think you're a badass, hun, Mina said with a laugh while using her elbow to push her shoulder. So there's no doubt you're gonna be an even bigger badass in the future. No doubt, Kyoka told her companion again. Hey, mommy, what's a bada? Eri said, looking up at her. Kyoka swiftly put a hand over the child's lips and said, that's an adult word. Nope. While the rest of the class was giggling over the little girl's near fall, Vlad covered his lips to keep from laughing. Ahem. Prowler cleared his throat to get attention, may we continue? Although his tone was slightly amused, the students opted to be quiet. Thank you. The lesson I would like you to take away from this part of our lecture is that, weak or not, a quirk is never what it appears to be in the beginning. He went on, throughout a person's life, and their time as a professional hero, their quirk will only grow stronger. And controlling that power as it grows is just as important as your training to become heroes. A hero whose quirk runs wild is of no use to society but a danger to those around them and themselves. Lethal Force was written on the chalkboard once he returned. As he finished writing, the Prowler turned back to the audience, who now all appeared to be quite uncomfortable. For the final part of this lecture, he began, is something I think that is overlooked in society when it comes to heroes. Before you say anything to discredit this, let me tell you right now that many professional heroes that are in the top 30 have a fairly large kill count. A boy from Class 1B named Juzo Honanuki questioned, even All Might. Especially All Might, Aizawa said. Even though he tries to avoid it, when a hero has a quirk as powerful as his, there's absolutely no way that he can work without having killed some of his opponents. He continued, even if some were accidental. Prowler nodded with agreement, not because he wasn't holding back, you understand, he told the pupils, but there are some situations that involve villains that are just too powerful and require the hero to use lethal force, or some that are just that stubborn, and will fight to the very end. And then there are the ones that give you no choice but to use lethal force from the start, Vlad King stated as he took his turn. Those types of villains are thankfully few and far between. Indeed, Prowler replied, most villains can be subdued easily with minimal damage to the area and just above average force needed to knock the villain out before handing them over to the police. He continued, that is about 80% of most villain assaults that heroes have to deal with, but that other 20% can never be forgotten. Unexpectedly, Denki found the strength to hold up his hand. Sir. Yes, Mr. Kaminari. He got up and asked, is there a way to tell if lethal force is necessary? That's an excellent question, young man. Vlad nodded his head in agreement. Especially since you have trouble with your quirk when using it, the guy remarked, alluding to the instances in which Kaminari overused his strength and burned his brain. Prodded, when going into a fight, it is crucial to gauge a villain's behavior, from their speech patterns to their mental state. He continued, all of these can be instrumental in deciding if lethal force is needed. He exhaled, for example, in my career, I have had 3 fatalities that were necessary. All of them were hostage situations where the villain had threatened to execute said hostages, or had already done so, leaving me no choice but to take them out in order to save the remaining hostages. However, using lethal force to end a fight should never feel easy, the Prowler continued. If it becomes easy, then you are no longer a hero, just another villain wearing a disguise that's latched onto an excuse to kill. Now, before we end today's lecture, are there any other questions? Prowler said, glancing down at his wrist. Momo held up her hand, sir. Yes, Miss Yaoyorozu. I don't mean to take attention away from the lesson, sir, she replied, but I'd like to ask about your involvement in an incident in New York some time ago. Izuku noticed his father staring at the girl while Vlad and Aizawa were both frowning, and he thought to himself, that's when he stopped calling. Ah, yes, I thought that might come up, he replied with a smile. The incident you're asking about involves a company called Roxon Energy, he continued. At the time, I was serving as a guard for their newest form of clean energy. A substance called Newform. He turned to his son, aware that his next words were about to alter everything. However, there was a hitch in their product. The Newform was not only volatile, but highly toxic. Those that were exposed to it developed marrow decay, which was incurable at the time. Even in small doses, the Newform caused countless severe health problems. He pointed to his suit. Thanks to my suit's design, I was able to avoid being affected by the toxins, but that doesn't mean there weren't casualties. He continued, when the CEO was confronted about the risks, he silenced those that spoke against him, which didn't sit well with me. So I took information about the dangers his products posed. However, he also framed me for stealing company secrets, which led to my immediate placement on the wanted list. With his gaze fixed on his kid, he concluded, does this tell you what you need to know? Later, however, the company was exposed, and shut down, granting me my, well, freedom, I suppose. Unaware that he wasn't actually speaking to her, Momo grinned and said, yes, sir, and thank you. The students stood up and started filing toward the door, and there was a little cheer as Prowler nodded, great. Now, the buses to take you to your next lesson should have arrived. Thank you for your time, and have a nice rest of the day. Hisashi sighed with relief behind his helmet, saying mainly to himself, God, I'm never doing this again. He turned to Hisashi and asked, sorry about this, but would you mind coming with us to the next class? While speaking into his headset. Understood. Be sure to give that impractical dunce a lecture for me. Hisashi turned to face him and hurriedly shouted, what? Why? While a specific blonde sneezed loudly, Aizawa explained, because a certain moron decided to duck out of his job today, and we need an extra set of hands since we're going to be doing rescue training. I know you're not fond of it, but you won't have to give any more lectures for the day, just some advice if you see the need. Hisashi moaned, not anticipating the new task, and hung his head, saying, that little rat is going to give me a raise. The blood user said, that was good work. Vlad gave him a shoulder slap and said, After a lecture like that, he'd better. 2 buses had been stationed outside the school, with Kendo and Momo guiding the females onto one bus and Izuku and Shota Narengeki guiding the lads onto the other. Just before the girl got on the bus, Vlad remarked, "Jiro, do we need to have someone pick up the little girl?" After noticing that little Eri was still with Kyoka. Kyoka nodded her assent. "She gets a little clingy because of how she was treated before Izuku rescued her," she said to the instructor, "so the principal gave us permission to let her tag along whenever she feels too insecure to be away from us. Remember that we'll be doing rescue training for the remainder of the day," Aizawa told the girl, scowling. "I'm not so sure about that this time, Jiro." "It's not a problem," Hisashi replied, grinning at the young couple, as he approached the group. "Nezu asked me to tag along for today since one of the supporting teachers is unable to attend, so I can watch her when you and Izuku are busy." "Hear that, Squirt, you get to spend some time with Grandpa," Kyoka said as she climbed the steps inside the bus. Eri was laughing joyfully, and his 2 friends were trying not to laugh. "Ahem, well, if you're sure about this, then I won't raise a fuss." "Gran," Vlad said, concealing a giggle behind a cough, causing the man's brow to quiver. He was pointing his left arm at him when he heard a clicking sound. "My wrist gauntlets have a low-caliber Gatling gun in them," said the man, "so I'd think very carefully about how you finish that sentence." Vlad complained, "No need," and then he escorted Kyoka aboard the bus. However, Hisashi could still hear him laughing. As he got on the bus, the man rolled his eyes and put on his mask once again. "This is gonna be a long day," he grumbled to himself. He wished he had boarded the other one once he was aboard. The girls were chatting excitedly, with the majority of them swooning over Eri and fussing about Kyoka's ring. The girl attempted to explain herself by saying, "Seriously, this is just a promise ring." However, she was nearly as much of a target as the young girl she was carrying because she was most likely the only girl in the first-year classes who was in a relationship. "Yeah, but that's still pretty special," commented Reiko Yanagi, a pale girl who was one of the 1B girls. "I mean, how many first-year guys would want to start a relationship, let alone a serious one, right off the bat?" she asked with a shy smile. As she pointed to the former invisible girl, Mina laughed from her side of the bus and said, "Normally, I'd agree with you there, but our Midori is a pretty special kinda guy. Take a look at Toru, for instance. He made that cuff she's wearing that allows her to use her quirk whenever she wants instead of having it on all the time." She flushed. "Yeah, I hadn't seen myself since I was 4 years old," she proudly caressed the back of her neck. "Boo it, when I found out about it, I was so excited about seeing what I looked like that I forgot that I was in the middle of our class and pretty much naked when I put it on." Still with the memory of seeing Toru's stunning physique just before Momo had covered her up again, Kyoka said, "And my oh-so-innocent boyfriend, plus the entire class, nearly got an eyeful." As crimson as Kirishima's colored hair, Toru pouted and muttered, "Besides, you guys weren't official, yet. I already said I was sorry." "Toru, not to cast doubt, but that kiss should have made it obvious." Momo gazed at the girl and chuckled, while Kyoka blushed profusely at the remembrance. Another female from Class 1B, Setsuna Tokage, exclaimed, "You guys kissed on camera." Just before her head floated off her body. Kyoka was a little uneasy about this, but she assumed it was a quirk of hers. Eri was not that fortunate and almost exploded Kyoka's eardrums with her loud scream upon seeing the girl's decapitated body. Kyoka yelled, "Whoa, whoa, Eri, calm down," as the girl covered her face with her jacket. "It's okay. Look, she's fine." As the girl's head floated back into position, Shiozaki Abara said, "Setsuna, pull yourself back together, quick." In the hopes that it would quiet the wailing kid. Trying to sound less panicked than she actually was, she added, "There now you see. She was just playing around, weren't you, Setsuna?" Yeah, I'm totally fine," Setsuna said to herself. "My quirk just lets me separate my body into smaller parts. I'm not hurt at all." The prowler heard his granddaughter cry and returned to their row, demanding hysterically, "What's going on?" With Eri's face still nestled into her shoulder, Kyoka looked up at the anxious man and comfortingly patted the child's back. "Hey, how long is the bus ride gonna be?" she said, a thought suddenly occurring to her. She got freaked out by Tokage's quirk. "About an hour, give or take," Vlad King responded. "And we're still not ready to leave, yet." He ended by growling at his cell phone. "Power Loader just sent me a text letting me know that one of his students is going to be joining us to assess the first year's abilities to better make their equipment. so now we have to wait on her. As she soothed the young child, Setsuna looked sick with dread. I am so sorry, she said, addressing Kyoka. I totally wasn't thinking that she'd get so scared that easily. Prowler lifted his visor's faceplate and inquired, what did you have in mind, Kyoka? Goggling at him, Kendo said, hey, whoa. You look just like. Kyoka smiled at her and said, my boyfriend. Yeah, this is his dad. Hisashi saluted the girl hesitantly. After that, Kyoka started to pat Eri's hair and said, Eri, sweetie, it's okay, no one's gonna hurt you, or anyone else here. But she came apart just like the others did when they were nice to me. Eri said, still covering her face. No, it's okay, she said. They're not the ones that hurt you. Everyone's been nice, remember? Eri gave a nod. Kyoka asked, see, as the young girl lifted her head. There's no one in this school that's gonna hurt you, Kyoka said, as Eri glanced at the other daughters. Then, in order to comfortably hold the girl, she turned her around. 'Cause you know that if someone even tried, either me, your daddy and your grandpa would beat them up, right? The young girl muttered, MMHM. I'm really sorry for scaring you, sweetie. Setsuna knelt down in front of her and said, if I'd known that I never would have done that. The young child continued to hold on to Kyoka, no longer wailing, and Kyoka grinned. As Setsuna sat back, she remarked, see, she's nice. Eri quickly recovered her composure when the other students warned her not to use their quirks in order to avoid frightening her again. And the young girl soon began to fall asleep, as Kyoka had foreseen. She said in a sing-song voice, someone's getting sleepy. A second later, she began to sing. Her words, hush now baby don't you cry, caught the other students' attention. Rest your wings, my butterfly, she said, and Vlad turned away from his phone. Hisashi grinned and went back to the front, while Eri leaned drowsily on her. When Kyoka finished singing to her, she fell asleep in a matter of seconds. They were all staring at her. Oh my gosh, Ochako said, smiling softly so as not to wake the sleeping kid. I didn't know you could sing like that. Her voice was full of adoration. That was so amazing. Truly, you are blessed with a God-given gift, Shiozaki murmured calmly, clasping her hands together. Although she was equally as impressed by her singing as everyone else, Kendo laughed and remarked, great, this'll just give Monoma something else to complain about. Hisashi simply laughed from his seat at the front of the bus, saying, if that boy of mine screws things up with her, then I'm never gonna let him hear the end of it as long as I live. Kyoka flushed as the others kept complimenting the girl for her singing. When Vlad saw a figure running toward the bus through the window, he snorted and said, if the kid's as smart as everyone is saying he is, then I don't think he'll be dumb enough to flub things with a girl like that. Ah, that must be our missing tag along, he said, opening the doors as the student arrived. What took you so long? Is there a Toru Hagakure on the bus? She asked, hefting a container that appeared to hold a costume. Finishing up some last-minute adjustments, she responded in a breathless huff, yet she managed to sound irritated at the teacher's query. Hearing her name, Toru got to her feet and exclaimed, I'm back here, May. Toru blinked her multicolored eyes in confusion, saying, oh, great. The rosette grinned broadly as she walked back, I got you a new costume design since Midoriya helped me get a better idea of what your quirk does. Ah, he must not have told you. When you gave us some of your hair to fabricate something that'll work with your quirk, I asked him if he could have a look at the hair follicles under a microscope. Momo gave her a curious look and asked, what did you find out? When we did some experiments with your hair, we found that your quirk works on any part of your body, Momo, May said, pointing to Toru. Yours, on the other hand, had nothing to do with your quirk, she said, glancing at the girl who had previously been invisible. She could basically produce anything from any part of her body, even her hair. Toru scowled and said, so, my quirk isn't that my body bends light. As the bus moved off, the girl yelled as the unexpected movement threw her off balance. Hey, a little warning would've been nice. She yelled at Vlad, shaking her head. Nope, sure didn't look like it, she added. Midoriya and I, whoa, said. With a frustrated tone, Vlad yelled back, we're already behind schedule because we had to wait on you. As she sat next Toru, holding the case in her lap, May sighed, see if I ever work on your equipment. Anyway, the two of us did a little research, and didn't find anything about your body that produces a quirk, she said. More perplexed than ever, the girl blinked and said, I still don't get it. Your invisibility is a psychic ability. Momo said with a smile. She means that you can control your quirk with your mind. She then spoke quietly as Eri stirred. Hisashi found himself using the sensors in his mask to listen more intently to the conversation up front. Toru was hearing something she couldn't believe. So I'm psychic? She asked. Kendo got closer. Psychic abilities have a really broad range and variety, Toru. She continued. For example, some can read minds and use telekinesis to move things from one spot to another, sometimes really big things, and some can see into the future on rare cases, but invisibility sometimes falls into the psychic category, too. So, I don't really need this anymore? The girl asked, blinking a few more times before glancing down at the power cuff on her wrist. In order to get the kid's attention, Hisashi called back, that depends. If your quirk has been active all this time, then you'll probably need to work on controlling it properly to make yourself visible all the time. Yeah, but that's why I made this new suit for you, Mei said, nodding in agreement. This new baby has a power dampening effect just like Izuku's cuff baby, based on the same tech that shuts your quirk off with the press of a button. She handed it to Toru, who opened it, adding, but when you turn it off to use your quirk, it'll turn invisible right along with you. As Toru raised the suit by the shoulders, Mina grinned and said, oh, that blue goes so great with your eyes, Toru. You'll look gorgeous in this, honey. Red in the face, Toru clasped the suit to her chest and said, thanks, Mina, before turning back to face Mei. And thank you, too, Mei. You've given me a lot to think about. Hey, thank Midoriya, Mei said with a smirk. I just designed a costume, but he's the one that pointed out that your quirk was mental, not physical. Giggling. Yeah, I'll ask Kyoka to give him a big ol' kiss for me. Toru, she said, and the girl blushed crimson, achieving the desired effect. Spiderman. Izuku did not have the peaceful ride he had anticipated for on the guy's bus. Since Nito Monoma wasn't stupid enough to fall for Shinso's quirk again after having already been struck by it, there was little anybody could do about his constant annoyance of the Class 1A members. Then there was the attitude of Tetsu. Although he and Kirishima were very similar, he had a superiority complex that was nearly as severe as Monoma's. With one of his notorious notebooks in hand, the lad sat next to Ida and Kaminari, taking notes on the pupils in Class 1B, simply accepting a noisy ride. Kaminari asked, so, you're like, a quirk expert right? As she peered curiously over his shoulder. With a little smile, Izuku remarked, hardly, closing the book. I've just been interested in them since I was little, he added. And since I was quirkless for a long time, I studied extra hard so I could take UA's test. Looking at him from the other side of the aisle, Shinso said, I keep forgetting that you were quirkless when you took the practical exam, with a frown. I know that my quirk isn't suitable for combat, but I gotta say that it takes guts for quirkless people to try something like that. Izuku begged with his buddies, who laughed, I tried so hard to break those stupid robots that my hands bled. Please don't tell Kyoka that. Izuku nodded. Whoa. Honanuki said, you didn't have a quirk when you went through the practical exam. You gonna rag on him, too? Kaminari questioned defensively, his hands sparking dangerously as he glared at the lipless teenager. Izuku laughed and said, honestly, I'm used to it. Take it easy. Bakugo sneered, he got lucky, that's the only reason he's here now. He sighed and sat back. I really can't argue with that, Izuku said, frowning. I did get lucky. The explosive blonde sneered, I worked my ass off to get here, but you've got the world's number. One hero backing you just because you were used as a science experiment. I was born great, but everything special about you came out of a bottle, he said, glaring directly at the green-haired arachnid. Hearing the ashen blonde's diatribe, Aizawa scowled. The underground hero pondered, Bakugo's therapy doesn't appear to be doing anything for that darned complex of his. This is going to be a hassle to deal with. You're just mad that he beat you in our first battle trial, Bakugo, Shinso said with a mocking smile. Whether his powers came out of a bottle or not, he's still a better hero candidate than you. Shinso, meanwhile, wasn't overly happy about Bakugo making fun of one of his few friends in the class. Why you? With his quirk fully activated, Shinso remarked, sit quietly for the rest of the bus ride. Bakugo sat back into his seat, his spine tightened, his jaw clenched shut, and he looked quiet but angry. Dude, you are one ballsy son of a bitch, Kaminari said, smiling at Shinso. You know he's not gonna forget this, right? He asked. I really can't bring myself to care too much, Shinso said with a shrug, sitting back and crossing his arms. That guy needs to get that chip off his shoulder before he turns into a villainized washout, he moaned. As he observed smoke rising from Bakugo's hands, Shiro grinned broadly and remarked, "Can't say I don't agree, but man is he gonna be pissed." Anger with the other class was no longer of appeal to Monoma. He was intrigued by the green-haired teenager he had heard so much about in the UA hallways. He smiled condescendingly and said, "So, you got your powers through some sort of gene manipulation. You know that doing that sort of thing is illegal, don't you?" The blonde had everyone's attention, whether they were incensed by the charge or curious about how his remarks would impact the typically kind teen. "You're lucky it didn't outright kill you for that matter, because most quirkless that do go through such a thing never make it past 5 minutes of having it done to them." Monoma had hoped that the youngster would become upset, but instead he simply smiled and laughed shyly. "Well, I will say that I was pretty bad off when it happened to me," he remarked. Kaminari gave him a perplexed expression. He continued, pointing to his left side, as Shinso and Iida waited for him to explain, "I actually have Kachan to thank for getting her to safety so Kyoka could get me to the hospital. It was just after I met Eri," he said, adding, "the man that was chasing her had a gun on him and managed to get a shot off that hit me in the side." Unexpectedly, Koda was the next to speak. "Why, you mean that you really did get shot?" the bashful giant inquired. Knowing that he had told them everything about the shooting, he nodded and said, "Yeah," reflecting with a chill. "I don't know what the doctor was thinking, but he took a chance and experimented on me, and probably saved my life. Apparently the bullet seriously damaged my organs, and I would have died without help," he said. Iida said, "And gave you an incredible mutation quirk," adding, "You've certainly done nothing wrong in my eyes." The blue-haired speedster grinned at his class representative and said, "And I'm quite certain that you never asked to be treated as a laboratory experiment." Monoma simply replied, his face displaying dissatisfaction. After giving Monoma a shady glance, Shinso nodded in agreement. "Plus you took in a kid," the brainwasher remarked. "Anyone that thinks otherwise has to be an idiot." In an attempt to lighten the somber tone, Kaminari nodded and said, "Anyway, back to me asking about you knowing a lot about quirks." He looked down at his hands and said, "Electrical-based quirks are pretty common, but mine comes with a huge drawback by shorting out my brain whenever I use too much power." He clenched his fists and said, "It makes me a pretty easy target, and the last thing I want is for some villain to use me as a hostage, or for a comrade to have to pick up my slack." Izuku gave him a curious glance and said, "I'll help out if I can," with a wide smile. "So let me ask, do you focus on forcing your power out of your body, or do you just let it loose?" He held up his right hand, allowing a few sparks to emerge from his skin, and said, "I just let it loose," shrugging. "The only thing I usually try to control is how much voltage I put out. There's really no resistance when the electricity comes out, I just can't direct it." Izuku smiled. "Then try focusing on both the output, and how you release it," he continued, "like forming a ball of lightning, or even shooting a bolt out of your hand." Denki raised his hands and said, "I can do that easily," nodding. "Shooting it is a different problem altogether, though." He made a throwing motion and added, "If I try to throw it, it either reabsorbs into my body, or it rebounds and shocks me senseless." "May I interrupt?" Iida inquired. "Thank you. Now, Kaminari, perhaps firing the blast needs a mental trigger," Izuku said with a smile and a nod. Denki pondered for a moment before the ball vanished. "You mean like pushing a button in my head?" she asked. "Or pulling a trigger," Shinso replied. "Whenever I use my quirk on someone, I always imagine the person I'm using it on trapped behind a steel door." "Makes sense, I guess," the electric blonde remarked with a nod of comprehension. "Perhaps I can give it a try later when we're working on our quirks." Spiderman, unknown place. "Are we ready yet?" Shigaraki asked impatiently as he tapped his foot. A big metal appendage materialized close to him, and he heard heavy footsteps. "No need to worry, my boy," murmured Dr. Garaki, while number 7 and number 8 stood at his side. His other huge arachnoid, number 6, was close behind him, its 6 arms restrained by a metallic rope fastened to Garaki's extra appendages. "We're running right on schedule. I'm so excited," Shigaraki muttered, grinning behind his severed hands, his red eyes almost sparkling. "I can hardly wait." Behind him, a black gateway materialized, and Kurogiri declared, "I have gathered all of those that wish to be a part of the assault. We are ready to move on your orders." With a sickeningly broad smile, The doctor said, well, then, we wouldn't want to keep all of those dear students waiting, would we? While the three creatures behind him snarled. The shadowy creature observed, it is rather unlike you to step out of the shadows like this. Kurogiri questioned, are you certain that you should be coming at all? Garaki laughed. I know, it's quite out of character for me, he stated. However, the chance to harvest samples from UA's little crop of first years is far too tempting for me to pass up, he said, reaching for his mustache to be pulled out. Besides, I'm quite interested to see for myself how my boys here will stand up against their older brother should we encounter him. Spiderman. Despite May's tardiness, the buses arrived on time, and the students were led out into the changing areas where their costumes were waiting for them. Izuku discovered that the 1B pupils were once more ogling him because to his scars. But Juzo was less apprehensive about them than his classmates. Damn, dude, he muttered as he was getting dressed. Man, Midoriya, that's some serious scarring. Nah, this isn't nearly as bad as it was a few years ago, Izuku replied casually, taking everything in stride. A lot of them have faded over time. Still, though, you gotta be pretty damn tough to take that sort of damage, Juzo observed, shaking his head. Respect. When he put the green and purple top of his outfit over his head, Izuku laughed and remarked, thanks, that actually means a lot. He put on his gauntlets after that. After checking his luggage, he began packing his utility belt with of mines, bombs, tracers, and plenty of his power cuffs. Honestly, it's thanks to these that I have such a high pain tolerance, he said. Then he checked to make sure he had enough of spare web cartridges and that his web shooters were loaded. Shota said, geez, you really come prepared, don't you? As he examined all the technology he was armed himself with. Hell yeah, he does, Kirishima said with a smile. When he faces an unknown, Midoriya always gets ready for war. Recalling his battle in the battle trial, Kaminari remarked, it's kind of his way of showing respect in combat, too. He'll come at you with everything he has without hesitation. As Izuku put on his mask, Shinso smiled at a perspiring Monoma and muttered, you would have been better off antagonizing Bakugo. The eyes lit up their frightening green color. The 1B students were sufficiently unnerved by the sight. Bakugo hissed at him and knocked shoulders with him as they walked out together. Watch it, ya damned nerd. You bumped into me, Thunderbomb. Izuku said, his mask boosting his self-confidence. It's plastique, ya loser. The arachnid joked, I hope you're the recyclable kind. I said plastique, not plastic dumbass. It's the same thing. The hell it is. With a frustrated shake of his head, Iida asked, when will those two ever grow up? With a hooting chuckle, Sato remarked, probably when Bakugo starts taking ballet lessons. So that means never, right? Shoto asked, glancing at the big teenager. Pretty much, Spiderman. Aizawa remarked, you took too long, as the students gathered inside the building. Vlad came up to him. You'll all need to work on getting changed faster from this point on, he stated. One of the few things Aizawa and I can agree on is the fact that time is the most important thing to a hero. Unexpectedly, there was another hero present in addition to the Prowler. Ochako exclaimed, oh my gosh, it's number 13. With the same joy as Izuku would whenever he encountered any hero. She's my absolute favorite hero. Well, it looks like I have a fan. The spacesuit-clad hero grinned, welcome to the Unforeseen Situation Joint, or USJ for short. Among the pupils' collective thoughts was, just like Universal Studio Japan. Here you'll be exposed to situations caused by natural disasters such as floods, earthquakes, and fires to name a few, Vlad said, and you'll learn how to react properly in such situations that cause you to rescue any civilians that may be caught in the chaos that follows such events. Aizawa said, which means that you will not be using your quirks to fight, instead you will be learning how to use them to save the lives of those that have been trapped or injured in the event of these situations. He glanced at Shota as well as Izuku, class reps, front and center. Shota and Izuku moved forward. Vlad approached Shota. You will divide the class into teams of 2, how you divide them is up to your discretion, but there should be at least one student from each class on a team with each other. He motioned to Izuku, and then your teams will be given assignments in the aforementioned areas to begin rescue training. Prowler was listening to the lesson plan from a distance, finding it useful, but he noticed something below. Some of the bulbs were blown out when the above lights flashed, a visible arc of electricity passing across them. Then a type of murky curtain started to form, getting big enough to let a truck pass through it, and then, to the man's horror, a number of people emerged. Prowler said angrily, We have intruders. To warn the teachers and pupils. The UA. He was looking down at more than 50 villains that he recognized from the police billboard wanted posters that had been smuggled in, even though Academy was meant to be a cutting-edge hero school. And there was no sign that the dang alarm was going off. As he prepared for the impending battle, he yelled at the underground hero, Aizawa, you have some explaining to do. What the hell is wrong with your security system? Why haven't the alarms gone off? He shouted. Kaminari, try your radio. The unkempt teacher yelled at the pupil, scowling at the man's tone. The blond boy scowled and tapped his earpiece, saying, someone's blocking the signal. Shit, all I'm getting is static. He cried back to the teacher. Izuku yelled out to the prowler, Dad. What's going on? As he moved closer Kyoka and Eri. Stay where you are. Aizawa yelled as he jumped halfway down the stairs, holding out his arm to keep the students back. Prowler said, these people are villains. As he chased after the man, Vlad following closely after. A young man with pale hair and hands covering his torso emerged as the group poured out of the portal, followed shortly after by. Izuku yelled, Dr. Tsubasa. As the stooped figure stumbled out of the vortex on 4 mechanical appendages that resembled tentacles. The last of the group filed out, taking on a humanoid shape, and the shadowy gateway shrank when he saw the young guy, his smile broad enough to break his face in two. Eraserhead, number 13, Vlad King, and the Prowler, it murmured, opening 2 yellow eyes in the black mist. It appears that the files you procured were a little deceptive. All Might doesn't seem to be here. Such a shame, Tsubasa remarked, twirling his mustache. I was rather looking forward to seeing how my boys would fare against such a foe. Tsubasa seems amused by the absence. In a high-pitched voice that made Izuku's skin crawl, the one with the severed hands complained, after all the trouble I went through to get that stupid folder, sneering, and I even went through the trouble of gathering so many friends to bring along with us. The doctor's eyes slid up towards the students, and those beady eyes fell directly on Izuku, Kyoka, and young Eri. There, my boy, he continued, looking up at the 3 guardians, we must look on the bright side. Look at all these little toys we get to play with. And it would seem that I get to see firsthand how my very first success performs in combat. With a much nicer tone, the villain with the hand covering his head nodded and said, and maybe All Might will come out if we kill a few of these kids, huh? With a broad smile, Tsubasa said, living or dead, I can extract samples from these wonderful crops either way. He looked up at Izuku, who he recognized even from the costume, and said, I had hoped to find you here today, Izuku. He tipped his hat toward the students, many of whom turned to the boy with the arachnid theme in bewilderment. Oh, do forgive our rudeness in interrupting your class, but as you have heard, All Might is the reason we are here. 3 imposing figures stepped around him, monstrous creatures that looked like bipedal spiders. But, seeing as the world's #1 dunderhead has yet to arrive, I hope you good people will allow myself and my associates to entertain ourselves, by ripping each of you apart. The villains around them started teasing and laughing at them. Whatever's jamming the communications has gotta be the work of one of these bastards, Quirks. Vlad sneered down at the group, cracking his knuckles menacingly. All we have to do is take him out, and the cavalry will be here in no time. When Aizawa and Prowler were getting ready, he popped his neck and tilted his head to the side. Been a while since I was in a decent fight, let alone a big old brawl like this, Hisashi said with a smile behind his mask. He primed his Gatling pistol, which was attached on his wrist. How about we make this a good teaching moment for the kids, shall we? He asked. I like the sound of that, Vlad remarked, smearing his knuckles with crystallized, hardened blood. Number 13, you protect the students, we'll handle these delinquents. Keep your guards up, they said they came here to kill All Might, remember? Aizawa replied, his goggles down over his glowing eyes. With a wicked gleam in his eyes, the Prowler said, gotta get past us first. He then leapt into the air, tucked his legs in, and fell the last distance down the stairs.
I will continue the story in next part. Till then, bye bye.